The phantom vehicles of Route 491. There is a stretch of asphalt that bleeds through the Four Corners region of the American Southwest, a desolate ribbon cutting across the Navajo Nation. It is a place of striking, barren beauty by day, characterized by jagged red rock formations and oceans of pale sagebrush. But when the sun drops below the horizon, the landscape changes. The temperature plummets, shadows stretch into unnatural shapes, and the isolation becomes absolute. This is Route 491. For nearly 8 decades, however, it carried a different designation, one that seemed to infect the very earth beneath the pavement. It was known as Route 666, the Devil's Highway. Commissioned in 1926 as the 6th spur of the legendary Route 66, the highway was burdened with a numeric association that immediately cast a shadow over its creation. For years, engineers and locals alike brushed off the designation as a mere administrative coincidence, but the road quickly earned a reputation soaked in blood and unexplained terror. The accident statistics on that endless, straight stretch of desert highway were consistently impossibly high. Fatalities occurred on clear days with dry roads and perfect visibility. Cars were found crushed along the shoulder with no evidence of another vehicle involved, no tire marks indicating a sudden swerve, and no logical explanation for the trauma inflicted upon the twisted metal. In May of 2003, state officials finally bowed to public pressure and indigenous leaders who argued the number was a cursed relic. The highway signs were replaced, Route 666 became Route 491. The politicians and highway patrol supervisors hoped that scrubbing the mark of the beast from the map would purge the highway of its dark legacy. They believed new metal signs would bring safety. But the land does not care about human administration. The geography remained unchanged, and the road continued to collect its toll in the dead of night. The local folklore of the Navajo has always warned against lingering in this territory after dark. There are hushed stories of skinwalkers, dark entities capable of taking animal form, keeping pace with vehicles traveling at 70 miles per hour. There are accounts of pale, featureless faces pressing against passenger windows in the middle of a desolate run. But among those who drive heavy freight for a living, there is a different, more mechanical terror. It is the legend of the phantom rigs, massive black trucks that hunt on the endless straightaways, leaving no trace but the wreckage of those they force off the road. To understand the dread, one must understand the environment. Picture a lone commercial driver hauling a heavy payload through the vast emptiness near the border of Utah and Colorado. The time is exactly 3 a.m. This is the hour when the human body begs for sleep, when the mind begins to play tricks, and when the veil between reality and nightmares wears dangerously thin. The driver sits high in the cab of an 18-wheeler, surrounded by the monotonous hum of diesel power and the relentless drone of heavy tires on cold asphalt. Beyond the reach of the headlights, the world ceases to exist. There are no streetlights, there are no distant farmhouses glowing in the dark. There is only the yellow centerline flashing past, a hypnotic metronome marking the passage of time through a void. The cabin temperature is warm, yet a deep chill seems to radiate from the glass of the windshield. The driver reaches for the radio dial, seeking the comfort of a late-night broadcast or the chatter of another trucker on the Citizens Band. The radio offers nothing. The steady signal of a distant country music station abruptly warps, the music bending out of tune before dissolving entirely. It is replaced by a thick, heavy hiss of static. The driver turns the dial, scanning through the frequencies. Every channel yields the same dense, aggressive white noise. Even the emergency channel is dead. The electronic isolation mirrors the physical isolation. The truck is a lone island of steel moving through a sea of black sand and stone. It is then that the driver checks the side mirror. Far in the distance, swallowed by the immense dark of the highway, twin points of light appear. They are headlights, burning with an intense, unnatural halogen glare. At first, they are a minor detail, just another traveler sharing the lonely road. But within a matter of seconds, the lights grow significantly larger. The distance is closing at a rate that defies the physics of a heavy vehicle. The driver checks the speedometer. The 18-wheeler is pushing 75 miles per hour. Yet, the lights in the mirror are approaching as if the driver's rig is parked on the shoulder. The driver grips the steering wheel tighter, expecting the violent rush of wind and the deafening roar of a modified engine as the reckless vehicle overtakes. A massive rig moving at that speed displaces a massive amount of air. It commands a physical presence, but as the blinding headlights fill the entirety of the side mirrors, turning the interior of the cab a stark, clinical white, there is no sound. The silence is the first true indicator of the nightmare. The driver's own diesel engine continues to hum, but from the approaching vehicle there is absolute quiet, no grinding of heavy gears. No roar of a supercharged engine, no heavy tires screaming against the asphalt. The massive shape pulls out from behind, gliding into the opposing lane to pass. The driver glances out the driver's side window, preparing to curse the reckless operator. Instead, the words die in the throat. The vehicle pulling alongside is another tractor-trailer, but it is deeply wrong. It is a colossal machine painted in a matte black so absolute that it seems to absorb the faint ambient light of the moon. There is no chrome trim, there are no reflective safety strips, there is no company logo painted on the side of the trailer. It is a silhouette of pure, heavy darkness given physical form, moving silently at an impossible speed. The phantom truck aligns itself perfectly with the driver's rig. They are moving parallel, hurtling through the desert night side by side. The driver looks across the narrow gap between the two massive machines, peering up into the cab of the black truck. The interior of the phantom rig is not lit by dashboard dials or a soft overhead light. It is pitch black. Yet, the driver's eyes adjust just enough to perceive the horrifying truth. The heavy leather seat is empty. There is no one behind the wheel. The massive steering column remains perfectly still, yet the truck maintains a flawless trajectory. There is no driver, no human element controlling this tons of hurtling steel. It is an empty vessel, operating with a malicious, independent will. Before the driver can fully process the impossible sight, the black truck begins to drift. It does not swerve violently, it moves with a slow, deliberate, and crushing intent. The phantom rig crosses the yellow center line, invading the driver's lane. The sheer mass of the black truck forces the driver to adjust the steering wheel, edging the 18-wheeler toward the right. The right side tires hit the rumble strip. The sudden, violent vibration shakes the cab, a desperate mechanical warning. The asphalt here is narrow. Beyond the thin shoulder lies a steep, crumbling embankment leading down into the dark, jagged ravines that line this section of Route 491. The phantom truck continues its silent push. It does not scrape against the driver's vehicle. There is no spark of colliding metal, only an oppressive, magnetic pressure forcing the living driver further out of the lane. The driver slams on the air brakes. The massive tires lock, screaming in protest as the heavy rig fights to shed speed. Plumes of acrid blue smoke erupt from the wheel wells. The truck bucks and shudders, the trailer threatening to jackknife as the rear wheels slide perilously close to the edge of the abyss. The world becomes a chaotic blur of vibration, the smell of burning rubber, and the terrifying pull of gravity toward the unseen canyon floor. As the driver's rig finally grinds to a violent halt, the front right tire resting mere inches from a fatal drop, the driver looks up. The black truck has not slowed down. It has not merged back into the lane, it simply continues its forward trajectory, the blinding red glow of its taillights fading into the distance. Then, in the blink of an eye, the red lights extinguish. The massive black shape dissolves into the desert night. There is no sound of an engine fading into the distance. There is no dust trail. The phantom vehicle simply ceases to be, leaving behind nothing but the cold, vast emptiness of the highway. The driver sits trembling in the frozen cab, hands fused to the steering wheel, chest heaving with shallow breaths. The radio crackles to life, the static abruptly replaced by the clear, sharp twang of a guitar from a distant station. The natural world has returned. But as the driver looks down past the hood of the truck into the yawning blackness of the ravine, a sickening realization takes hold. Down in the depths of those canyons, hidden by the shadows and the jagged rocks, lie the rusted, twisted frames of vehicles that never made it home. They belong to the drivers who did not wake up in time, the ones who did not hit the brakes fast enough when the empty black rigs silently pushed them over the edge. Route 491 may have a new sign, but the pavement remains stained with the past, and the isolated night still belongs to the things that hunt on the Devil's Highway. One Appalachian hauler has been avoided since 1976. It began with the sudden and absolute silence of the tracking hounds. On a freezing November morning in 1976, a search party of 12 men walked into a narrow, deeply shadowed gorge at the base of Blacktop Ridge, looking for a family of 4 who had not been seen in town for 3 consecutive weeks. The dogs had been pulling hard on their heavy leather leashes, eager to trace the familiar scent of wood smoke, old canvas, and livestock. But as the men crossed the tree line into the permanent gloom of the hollow, the hounds simply sat down in the heavy frost. They did not whine, they did not bark at the empty woods. They stared directly into the dense thicket of black walnut trees, their ears pinned flat against their skulls, trembling violently and refusing to take another step forward into the dark. The locals of the county had always kept a respectful, quiet distance from the deep woods of the Appalachian Mountains. There was an unspoken understanding among the older generations that the jagged geography possessed a memory far older than the mining towns built on its edges. But the family living deep in the hollow had been there for over 2 decades. They were quiet, self-sufficient people who traded timber at the local mill and hunted white-tailed deer to survive the bitter mountain winters. According to county tax records from that era, their nearest neighbor lived exactly 4 miles away down a winding, unpaved dirt road. It was this isolated neighbor who finally walked to a payphone at a gas station and called the local dispatcher when the smoke stopped rising from the family's stone chimney and the echoing sounds of their chopping axes ceased entirely. When the search party realized the dogs would not move, they made the decision to leave the paralyzed animals tied securely to a rusted steel guardrail near the main highway. As soon as the men stepped past the tree line without the hounds, the atmosphere within the forest shifted violently. Witnesses later reported in private journals that the temperature within the hollow dropped drastically, plunging far beyond the normal seasonal chill. The heavy frost on the dead autumn leaves appeared unnaturally thick, coating the dark forest floor like jagged shards of broken glass. Every heavy boot step cracked loudly in the freezing cold air, yet the sound did not echo through the trees. The dense, interwoven canopy seemed to absorb the noise instantly, deadening the men's voices as they called out names into the thick, gray morning mist. For the first mile of the hike, the woods were merely quiet. But as they ventured deeper into the gorge, the natural landscape began to change in subtle, deeply unsettling ways. The typical sounds of a mountain morning, the chatter of gray squirrels, the rustling of black crows in the high branches, the wind pushing through the dried pine needles, were completely absent. The stagnant air tasted faintly of copper and old, overturned soil. Some investigators later suspected that the men were already experiencing a form of environmental sickness, a disorientation born from the sheer, suffocating silence of the deep woods. They walked in a tight, single-file formation, their hunting rifles unslung and held tightly against their heavy winter coats, instinctively scanning the empty trees. The geographical features of the hollow soon began to contradict the maps the men had memorized. According to the official county surveys, a rushing creek known as Deadwater Run was supposed to cut directly across the old logging trail, feeding into the larger river several miles away. But when the search party reached the steep ravine where the water should have been flowing, they found only a dry, jagged trench. The riverbed was completely devoid of moisture, the exposed stones bleached white and brittle like old bone. The air above the empty trench shimmered slightly, distorting the shapes of the dead trees on the opposite bank. Several men reported feeling a sudden, intense pressure behind their eyes, a deep phantom ache that only worsened as they crossed the dry rocks and moved deeper into the designated search grid. 2 miles down the abandoned trail, the men found the first undeniable anomaly. Stretched across the dirt path was a line of woven branches meticulously tied together with dried, thorny vines. It was not a standard property fence, but a dense barricade standing waist-high, stretching endlessly into the dark woods on either side of the road. Tangled within the intricate wooden lattice were hundreds of small, rusted iron bells strung up alongside the hollowed-out skulls of small woodland rodents. The metal bells hung perfectly still in the windless air. The men had to carefully dismantle a section to pass through, holding the rusted metal silent with their cold fingers, entirely unsure why a pragmatic, hard-working family would have spent days, perhaps weeks, constructing such a strange and extensive boundary line. Beyond the barricade of bones and bells, the forest looked entirely dead. The towering oak and pine trees had been violently stripped of their bark, leaving pale, bone-white trunks rising like skeletal fingers into the gray sky. According to the accounts passed down through the community, the woods here smelled sharply of ozone and sulfur, a heavy, metallic scent that burned the back of the throat and made their eyes water. The silence had deepened into a physical pressure against their eardrums, a quiet so heavy and absolute it felt like slowly descending into deep water. No one spoke. The urge to turn back was overwhelming, but the county sheriff pressed forward, leading them toward the clearing where the cabin was supposed to be. They reached the family homestead just before noon, though the sky above the hollow was so dark it looked like late evening. The wooden cabin stood at the center of a shallow, bowl-shaped depression surrounded by the towering dead pines. The heavy front door was wide open, swaying slightly on its rusted iron hinges without a breeze. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, and no footprints in the thick frost leading away from the wooden porch. But scattered across the wide dirt clearing were dozens of personal items. Cast iron cooking pots, heavy winter coats, framed family photographs, steel hand tools, and thick wool blankets had been placed carefully on the frozen ground. They were arranged in perfect, mathematical concentric circles, radiating outward from the front steps like ripples in a dark pond. As the sheriff cautiously approached the outer ring of the strange arrangement, he noticed a deeply unsettling detail about the objects. Every single item had been meticulously cleaned. The heavy steel axes were completely free of rust or sticky wood sap. The cast iron skillets held no trace of cooking grease or black soot. Even the worn leather work boots, placed neatly next to a stack of folded winter coats, were completely spotless, devoid of the heavy mountain mud that coated everything in the entire region. It was as if the family had spent their final hours systematically purging every trace of their daily labor from their possessions, preparing them for an exhibition that no one was ever meant to see. Inside the cabin, the stillness was absolute and entirely suffocating. The sheriff stepped slowly over the wooden threshold into a living room, coated entirely in a fine, pale gray dust. It looked exactly like wood ash, but there was no smell of a recent fire, and the large stone fireplace was completely empty. The thick dust lay undisturbed over the wooden dining table, the handmade rocking chairs, the cold cast iron stove, and the unmade beds in the far corner. When the men shone their heavy brass flashlights into the gloom, they realized something impossible. The ash was only present on the furniture and the horizontal floorboards. The vertical walls and the low wooden ceiling were perfectly clean, completely untouched by whatever had settled like a blanket over the room. On the exact center of the dining table, resting precisely in the middle of an ash-covered ceramic dinner plate, was a heavy brass pocket watch. It belonged to the father of the missing family. The sheriff picked it up with a heavy gloved hand, wiping the thick gray dust from the cracked glass face. The intricate metal hands of the watch were moving, but they were spinning backward at a rapid, frantic pace. The faint, mechanical ticking sound was the only noise in the entire room, a fluttering, unnatural rhythm that seemed incredibly loud and abrasive in the dead quiet of the abandoned cabin. As the men gathered tightly in the cramped space, a new sound drifted up from the floorboards. It came from the root cellar located directly beneath the kitchen. It was a slow, rhythmic thumping, followed by a human voice. The men froze instantly, their hands dropping to their holstered sidearms. One of the deputies called out, loudly identifying themselves as the County Rescue Squad, demanding that whoever was down there come up the stairs slowly with their hands empty. The voice from beneath the floorboards answered, but it did not ask for help. Instead, it repeated the deputy's exact words back to him. The tone was perfectly flat, devoid of any panic or natural human emotion, and it sounded heavily distorted, like a 911 dispatcher speaking through a broken and static-filled radio. The sheriff silently ordered two men to pry open the heavy wooden trapdoor leading down into the subterranean darkness. As they wedged a heavy steel crowbar beneath the iron handle, the mimicking voice abruptly stopped. The rhythmic thumping ceased entirely. The men pulled the door upward on its groaning hinges, fully expecting the suffocating smell of decay or the sudden rush of trapped, stale air to hit their faces. Instead, a wave of freezing cold washed over their heavy leather boots, instantly frosting the denim of their jeans. The bright flashlight beams cut through the pitch blackness below, revealing rows of empty wooden preserves, shelves, and a hard-packed dirt floor. The small cellar was completely empty. There was nowhere to hide, and no secondary exit leading out into the yard. But as the bright beams of light swept slowly across the back wall of the underground room, the men noticed something carved deeply into the cold earth. It was a single word, repeated endlessly, covering every visible inch of the cellar walls, from the floor up to the wooden beams of the ceiling. The letters were jagged and frantic, seemingly gouged into the hard dirt with bare, bleeding hands. The word was simply, wait. Before anyone could speak a word of comfort or confusion, the heavy brass pocket watch resting on the table above them violently shattered. The glass face exploded outward in a shower of sharp fragments, and the frantic ticking abruptly died, plunging the cabin back into absolute silence. The search party did not stay to investigate the surrounding woods. According to the whispered accounts that circulated through the rural community for decades, the 12 men backed out of the cabin without ever turning their backs to the open doorway. They did not touch the bizarre concentric circles of personal belongings arranged in the frozen yard. They did not speak a single word to one another as they marched aggressively back through the pale, barkless trees, their eyes fixed firmly on the dirt trail ahead of them. When they finally reached the barricade of bones and rusted bells, they found that the section they had carefully dismantled had been completely woven back together. The thorny vines were fresh, and the rusted bells were swaying slightly, though there was still no wind in the gorge. Upon returning to the main road at the very edge of the hollow, the men found that the tracking dogs were gone. Their heavy leather collars remained attached to the rusted steel guardrail, but the thick metal buckles had not been unfastened. The thick leather had simply been sliced clean through by something incredibly sharp. The hounds were never found by anyone in the county. The sheriff filed a highly abbreviated, heavily redacted police report the following morning. Before the week was out, he privately requested that the County Road Commission deliver 3 massive dump trucks of heavy gravel and jagged limestone boulders to the entrance of the dirt road leading into the hollow. Within days, the path was completely blocked, barricaded behind a massive wall of stone and a heavy steel chain locked tightly across the surrounding trees. The families of the search party members noted profound and disturbing changes in the men who returned from the hollow. They suffered from severe insomnia, pacing their small homes late into the night, endlessly checking the deadbolts on their doors and windows. When they did sleep, they were plagued by violent night terrors, waking up drenched in cold sweat, but refusing to describe what they had dreamed. One of the younger deputies entirely lost his hearing in his left ear just 3 days after the search. Medical examinations at the local clinic could find no physical cause for the sudden deafness, But the deputy privately confessed to his wife that he had not lost his hearing at all. Instead, he claimed that a continuous, flat voice was constantly whispering a single word directly into his eardrum, drowning out all other sounds in the natural world. The local newspaper published a brief two-sentence article stating that the family had suddenly relocated out of state due to severe financial difficulties. No further search efforts were ever authorized by the state police. The county slowly and quietly revised its geological survey maps over the following 10 years, intentionally omitting the old logging trail and the narrow, shadowed gorge beneath Blacktop Ridge. The area was simply absorbed into the blank green space of protected wilderness, effectively erased from official existence. The men who walked into the woods that day rarely spoke of it again, and several of them moved entirely out of the Appalachian region before the heavy snow melted the following spring. Today, the deep hollow remains entirely untouched by modern development. Hikers who attempt to navigate the dense, untamed woods often report an unnatural sense of profound disorientation as they approach the eastern slope of the high ridge. Digital navigation devices fail entirely, analog compass needles spin aimlessly in slow circles, and the thick forest canopy seems to trap the dying daylight, plunging the surrounding trees into premature darkness by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Those who stray too close to the unmarked boundary line often claim to experience sudden nosebleeds and severe migraines, accompanied by the overwhelming, primal feeling of being intently observed from the high, dark branches. Some local residents still firmly believe that the ancient barrier of woven vines and rusted bells still exists, hidden deep within the impenetrable overgrowth constantly maintained by an unseen presence. They say that if you find yourself wandering near the rocky base of the ridge and the normal sounds of the forest suddenly drop away, you must immediately turn around and walk directly back the way you came. You must never speak a word, and you must never run, because the quiet in those dark woods is not empty. It is waiting and it is listening. But the most disturbing rumors come from generations of local hunters who track deer along the upper ridges during the absolute dead of winter. When the bitter wind is entirely still and the heavy frost coats the frozen ground, they say you can look down into the shadowed, forgotten gorge and see thin, pale columns of gray smoke rising from a stone chimney that by all official accounts no longer exists. And if you stand very still and listen closely to the suffocating silence, you can sometimes hear a flat, emotionless voice echoing faintly up from the deepest part of the hollow, perfectly mimicking the sound of your own quiet breathing. A Maine case from 1994 involved knocking for 7 nights. It started on the second night of November, 1994, at exactly 2:15 a.m., with a sound that did not belong in the deep, isolated woods of northern Maine. A heavy, rhythmic thudding against the thick, double-paned glass of a sliding patio door. Sarah Elias woke with a sudden, freezing jolt, the heavy woolen blankets pulled tightly up to her chin. The cabin was entirely dark, the surrounding forest swallowed by a black, moonless winter night. She lay perfectly still in her second-floor bedroom, her breath creating faint clouds in the freezing air, waiting to see if the sound had been born from a fading dream. 10 seconds later, the sound returned. It was methodical, blunt, and immensely heavy. 3 slow strikes. A long, agonizing pause. 3 more strikes. The Elias cabin was situated at the end of a 4-mile dirt logging road near the dense, sprawling shores of Moosehead Lake. The nearest permanent neighbor was located across a frozen inlet, entirely inaccessible during the bitter winter storms that routinely buried the region. Sarah had traveled there alone to clear out the property, preparing the old structure for a long overdue family sale. The power had failed hours earlier beneath the weight of ice forming thick layers on the remote power lines, plunging the house into complete darkness. When the knocking first pulled her from sleep, her rational mind frantically searched for an explanation. She assumed it was a lost hunter, or perhaps a stranded motorist who had somehow managed to navigate the treacherous, unplowed logging road. But the wind outside was howling, driving sharp ice against the wooden siding of the house in a chaotic roar, while the knock remained distinct, unhurried, and perfectly timed. She wrapped a heavy woolen blanket tightly around her shoulders, picked up a heavy iron flashlight from her bedside table, and walked slowly down the narrow, creaking wooden staircase. The cabin was freezing, the internal temperature dropping rapidly without the hum of the electric furnace. The beam of her flashlight cut a pale, dusty yellow circle through the oppressive darkness of the living room, illuminating the worn rug and the stone fireplace. When she finally reached the sliding glass door at the back of the house, she fully expected to see a desperate face pressed against the frost, begging for shelter. Instead, there was only the black, mirrored reflection of the room behind her. She reached out and flipped the wall switch for the exterior floodlight, acting on pure, ingrained habit, fully aware the backup generator was not running. The knocking stopped the exact second her fingertips touched the cold plastic of the switch. Morning broke gray and blindingly cold, casting long skeletal shadows through the ancient pine trees that surrounded the property. Sarah, dressed in heavy layers, laced up her thick winter boots and walked the perimeter of the cabin to investigate. The snow was pristine, sparkling under the muted light, completely untouched by human boots or the heavy paws of a wandering bear. The area directly beneath the patio door was completely smooth, presenting a solid, unbroken sheet of white powder stretching out toward the dark tree line. There was absolutely no physical evidence that anyone or anything had stood on the wooden deck the night before. Desperate for comfort, she convinced herself it had been a heavy, frozen tree branch driven by the storm striking the glass in a strange, repetitive rhythm. She spent the rest of the short daylight hours chopping firewood, bringing the heavy logs inside, and securing the thick wooden storm shutters over all the ground floor windows. The second night thoroughly destroyed any comforting, rational theories she had built during the daylight hours. At exactly midnight, the knocking returned, but it was no longer testing the glass of the patio door. It began at the heavy oak front door of the cabin. The sound was incredibly blunt, echoing through the empty wooden entryway with a startling, violent volume. 3 heavy strikes, a long, agonizing pause of exactly 1 minute, 3 more strikes. Sarah sat on the top step of the second-floor landing, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs, her hands trembling as she clutched a heavy iron fire poker. She sat in absolute darkness, listening carefully as the source of the sound slowly began to move. It did not sound like footsteps moving across the wooden boards of the front porch. There was no familiar crunching of heavy boots in the deep snow, no creaking of the frozen wooden planks, no rustling of winter coats. There was only the dreadful, vast silence of the winter night, followed suddenly by 3 heavy strikes against the kitchen window on the eastern side of the house. 10 minutes later, the terrifying knocking shifted to the living room window on the western wall. Whatever was waiting outside was slowly circling the property, testing the perimeter, searching for a weakness in the walls. The strikes were so forceful that Sarah could hear the old window frames rattling violently in their wooden casements. She spent the remainder of the night huddled in the furthest corner of her bedroom, her back pressed hard against the cold plaster, watching the locked bedroom door until the sun finally began to rise at 6:30 in the morning. On the 3rd day, the paralyzing fear was replaced by a desperate need to escape. She packed a small canvas duffel bag, determined to drive the 4 miles down the logging road to the nearest paved highway, no matter how deep the snowdrifts had become. The outside temperature had plunged to 5 degrees below zero, freezing the moisture inside her nose with every breath. When she climbed into her pickup truck and turned the heavy metal key in the ignition, the engine did not turn over. There was no clicking of the starter, no struggling whine of the motor, no dimming of the dashboard lights. When she lifted the heavy steel hood of the truck, she found that the thick battery cables had been severed. It was not the jagged gnawing of a desperate, starving animal. The cuts were perfectly clean, sliced straight through the thick rubber and heavy copper wire with absolute precision. She was entirely isolated, stranded 40 miles from the nearest town. The third night brought a terrifying, impossible shift in the pattern. The knocking did not start at the doors or the windows. At exactly 11:15 p.m., the heavy, hollow sound came from directly above her head. Something was moving on the steep, slanted roof of the cabin. The heavy wooden support beams groaned under a sudden, immense, shifting weight, followed immediately by 3 hollow thuds against the frozen asphalt shingles. The terrible sound vibrated down through the wooden framework of the house, shaking decades of loose dust onto the bedroom floor. Sarah stared wide-eyed at the ceiling, paralyzed by the sheer physical impossibility of the situation. The roof of the cabin was pitched at a severe angle designed to shed heavy snowfall and was currently covered in 3 feet of slick, deadly ice. Nothing should have been able to stand up there, let alone strike the wood with such methodical, deliberate, and devastating force. The roof knocking continued for a full hour, dragging slowly from one end of the cabin to the other before sudden silence fell over the property. Sarah waited in the dark, her breath pluming in the freezing air of the bedroom, her grip tightening on the iron poker. Just as her exhausted muscles began to relax, the 3 strikes returned. This time, they came from deep beneath the wooden floorboards on the first floor. The cabin sat elevated on a shallow dirt crawlspace, barely high enough for an adult to drag themselves through on their stomach in total darkness. The sound was slightly muffled by the thick fiberglass insulation stuffed between the joists, but the rhythm remained entirely identical. 3 strikes. A 1-minute pause. 3 strikes. Something was positioned directly beneath the living room floor, knocking upward against the wood, tracking her movements through the ceiling. By the 4th day, severe sleep deprivation had begun to warp the edges of her reality. Shadows pooling in the corners of the empty rooms seemed to stretch, quiver, and linger just a moment too long when she moved her flashlight. The vast silence of the house was deafening, pressing heavily against her ears like deep water. She ventured outside for only 10 minutes to frantically gather the remaining firewood from the outdoor shed. It was during this panic trip that she noticed the perimeter of the house. There were still no footprints anywhere in the deep snow, but there was a continuous, shallow trench perfectly circling the cabin. It looked exactly as if a heavy, smooth, rounded object had been dragged slowly through the snow, maintaining an exact distance of 2 feet away from the exterior walls. The bizarre trench never deviated in its distance from the house, forming a perfect, unbroken circle around her prison. The 5th night marked the terrifying turning point in the ordeal. The massive winter storm outside had completely died down, leaving a still, crystalline cold in its wake. The silence of the forest was absolute, almost suffocating. At exactly 2 in the morning, the knocking began once again, but it severely lacked the muffled, hollow distance of the previous nights. The sound was sharp, incredibly resonant, and entirely too close. Sarah realized with a sickening, dizzying drop in her stomach that the knocking was coming from inside the walls of the house. It was echoing directly up from the darkness of the basement stairwell. She had securely locked the heavy basement door on the very first day, even taking the time to shove a heavy wooden dresser across the hallway to block the frame. Now, as she stood frozen in absolute terror at the top of the main staircase, she listened to the horrifying rhythm. 3 heavy thuds against the inner wood of the basement door. A 1-minute pause, 3 more thuds. Whatever had been circling the cabin in the snow, whatever had been dragging itself beneath the floorboards, was now standing on the wooden basement steps, violently knocking to get into the main hallway. Sarah backed away slowly, retreating silently up the stairs, never taking her wide eyes off the dark landing below. Once inside her bedroom, she locked the door, braced a wooden chair under the handle, and pushed her heavy oak bed frame across the floor to barricade herself in. On the 6th night, the patterned knocking escalated into a continuous, deafening assault that defied all reason. It began immediately at sundown and simply did not stop. It came from all sides of the house simultaneously. The heavy oak front door, the back wooden deck, the shuttered kitchen windows, the steep roof, and the barricaded basement door were all struck at once. The heavy, rhythmic thuds overlapped in the darkness, creating a maddening tribal drumbeat that literally shook the entire structure of the house. The framed family photographs lining the hallway vibrated right off their rusty nails, shattering violently on the hardwood floors. Sarah sat huddled tightly in the dead center of her bedroom floor, rocking back and forth with her hands pressed painfully hard over her ears. Desperate for anything else, she turned on a small battery-operated emergency radio, hoping to catch the local weather band, praying to hear a human voice. She rotated the small plastic dial with trembling fingers, pushing through thick walls of buzzing static. There were no voices, there was no music, there was no emergency broadcast, but as she tuned slowly past a dead frequency, the thick static suddenly dropped away into a low, droning electric hum. From the small, tinny speaker of the radio, she heard the sound. 3 heavy strikes. A pause. 3 heavy strikes. The radio was broadcasting the exact rhythm of the knocking that was currently tearing her house apart. It was as if the small device had tuned directly into the very frequency of the terror waiting outside. She violently crushed the plastic radio beneath the heel of her heavy winter boot, permanently silencing the speaker, but the overlapping knocking against the wooden walls continued unceasingly until the first pale light of dawn. The 7th night brought a completely different, infinitely worse kind of horror. There was no overlapping chaos, no deafening barrage against the exterior walls. Instead, there was an absolute, suffocating, breathless silence. Sarah waited in the freezing dark of her deeply barricaded bedroom, clutching a large steel hunting knife, her eyes wide and burning fiercely from exhaustion. The antique mechanical clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet room, counting down the dreadful minutes. Midnight passed without incident. 1 a.m. passed. 2 a.m. passed in total silence. She began to desperately hope that the terrible ordeal was finally over, that whatever had laid siege to the cabin had finally moved on into the deep, frozen woods. Then, at exactly 3:43 a.m., she heard it. The knocking did not come from the exterior walls of the house, it did not come from the steep roof or the dark basement. The 3 slow, methodical strikes came from the empty space of the wall directly behind her wooden headboard, the thin interior wall that separated her bedroom from the empty spare guest room. She slowly crawled backward away from the bed, moving silently toward the far corner of the room, her breathing shallow and ragged. Exactly 1 minute later, the knocking moved. It struck the heavy wooden panels of her own locked bedroom door from the hallway side. Then, incredibly, the sound moved entirely outside. It struck the exterior glass of her second-floor bedroom window, a window that was suspended exactly 30 feet in the air, featuring no balcony, no fire escape, and absolutely no tree branches anywhere nearby. After the 3 terrifying strikes on the second-story glass, the rhythm finally broke for the very first time. Instead of a 1-minute pause, a completely new sound began. A slow, agonizing, ear-piercing screech of heavy metal dragging against the frosty glass. It sounded exactly like a thick, rusted iron nail being slowly pulled across the fragile window pane, searching blindly for a seam, searching for a weakness in the wooden frame. The terrible scratching moved slowly from the top left corner of the window entirely down to the bottom right, sending a violent, sickening shiver straight down Sarah's spine. She crawled desperately into the small bedroom closet, pulled a pile of heavy winter coats completely over her head, squeezed her eyes shut in the absolute darkness, and waited in terror for the sound of shattering glass. 4 days later, a massive Yellow County snowplow finally managed to break through the towering snowdrifts, blocking the old logging road, clearing a passable path all the way to the Elias property. 2 local deputies followed closely behind in a 4-wheel drive vehicle, responding to a frantic, repeated welfare check requested by Sarah's worried family down in Boston. When the officers finally arrived, they found the isolated cabin half buried in fresh, sparkling snow. There was no smoke rising from the stone chimney. The heavy oak front door was entirely unlocked, swinging slightly inward with the bitter cold winter breeze. The deputies immediately drew their service weapons and stepped cautiously inside the freezing dark, loudly calling out her name. The cabin remained utterly, completely silent. The interior of the house was freezing, but perfectly, immaculately tidy. The kitchen counters were clean and wiped down, the living room furniture was undisturbed, the heavy wooden shutters were still tightly secured over all the ground floor windows. But when the two deputies slowly reached the back hallway, they found the heavy wooden dresser pushed violently aside. The thick door leading down to the dark basement was securely closed, but the wood itself was severely, unimaginably damaged. Hundreds of deep, jagged, overlapping indentations completely covered the surface of the wooden door, looking exactly as if someone had struck it repeatedly with terrifying strength using the rounded end of a heavy iron sledgehammer. The thick wood was splintered, cracked, and concaved inward, yet the heavy brass deadbolt remained perfectly locked from the outside. Sarah Elias was never found. The county police searched the surrounding winter woods for 2 solid weeks using highly trained tracking dogs, but the dogs completely refused to step past the initial tree line, simply sitting down in the deep snow and whining nervously at the dark, empty gaps between the towering pine trees. The official missing person report, formally filed on the 14th of November 1994, remains permanently open in the county archives, gathering dust in a filing cabinet. The Elias cabin stood completely empty for 20 long years before finally collapsing under the immense crushing weight of a severe winter storm. But the locals still strictly avoid the old logging road once the sun goes down. According to the older, superstitious residents of the town, if you park your car near the rotting ruins at exactly 2 in the morning and turn off your engine, you do not hear the wind blowing through the trees. You hear 3 hollow, rhythmic thuds echoing slowly and patiently from deep within the frozen black earth. A West Virginia property was abandoned after something was found below. The flashlight beam cut through the thick, swirling dust of the root cellar, coming to rest on a heavy steel hatch that had no reason to be there. Thomas, an independent property appraiser contracted by a distant out-of-state trust, stood in the freezing dampness of the underground room and wiped away a layer of grime from the metal. The county blueprints in his leather satchel showed only a standard stone foundation for this isolated 1930s timber house in the dense Appalachian foothills. There was no mention of a subterranean extension, and certainly no record of the 4 massive, rust-pitted iron padlocks securing the hatch to the concrete floor. Something about the way the chains were wrapped suggested they were not meant to keep intruders out, but to keep the hatch firmly closed against whatever lay beneath it. The silence of the house above was heavy and absolute. It was late November of 2014, and the property sat at the end of a forgotten logging road off Highway 39, 20 miles from the nearest town. The previous owner, a retired structural engineer named Elias Vance, had died in a nursing home 3 months prior, leaving the 80-acre estate to a corporate trust. Thomas had spent the afternoon cataloging the main floors, noting the peeling wallpaper, the water damage in the ceiling, and the strange, obsessive way the windows had been boarded up from the inside. But it was here, in the windowless cellar, that the true nature of the property began to reveal itself. Kneeling on the cold floor, Thomas noticed a faint, rhythmic vibration traveling through the soles of his boots. It was incredibly subtle, like the distant rumble of a heavy freight train miles away, yet there were no train tracks anywhere in this part of the county. He placed his bare hand flat against the center of the steel hatch. The metal was unnervingly warm to the touch, a stark contrast to the near-freezing ambient temperature of the cellar. A thin wisp of foul-smelling air, reminiscent of ozone and old stagnant water, drifted up from the microscopic gap between the hatch and its housing. Thomas pulled his hand back, a cold prickle of unease washing over his shoulders. He returned the following morning shortly after 9 o'clock, carrying a heavy-duty battery-powered angle grinder and a crowbar. The morning fog was thick, clinging to the skeletal black trees surrounding the property and swallowing the sound of his truck door shutting. Down in the cellar, the air felt even more oppressive than the day before. The vibration was still there, steady and low, humming beneath the earth. Thomas set to work on the chains. The high-pitched scream of the grinder against the iron padlocks filled the small stone room, throwing bright showers of orange sparks into the shadows. It took nearly 40 minutes to cut through all 4 locks. When the final chain dropped to the concrete with a heavy, dead clatter, the cellar suddenly felt entirely too quiet. Thomas wedged the flat end of the crowbar under the lip of the hatch and leaned his weight backward. The metal shrieked as the rusted seal broke. A sudden, forceful exhalation of warm, dead air rushed out from the dark void below, carrying a smell so ancient and dense it made him gag. It smelled like wet copper, decaying limestone, and something faintly chemical, like antiseptic masking rot. He clicked his heavy tactical flashlight up to its highest setting and shined the beam down into the opening. The light did not hit a dirt floor or a simple root storage bin. It revealed a perfectly circular concrete shaft descending straight down into the earth, lined with heavy industrial steel rungs bolted into the gray walls. The shaft went down farther than his light could reach, disappearing into a haze of floating particulate matter. According to local property laws, an appraiser was only required to document accessible square footage, but an unrecorded subterranean structure could drastically alter the valuation or liability of the estate. Against his better judgment, Thomas secured his satchel, tested the first iron rung with his heavy boot, and began the descent. The air grew steadily warmer with each step down into the dark. He counted the rungs as he went: 20, 30, 40. The square of gray light from the cellar hatch grew smaller and smaller above him. By the time his boots finally struck a solid concrete floor, he had climbed down at least 60 feet beneath the West Virginia soil. The space at the bottom of the shaft was pitch black. Thomas swept his flashlight around, illuminating smooth, seamless poured concrete walls. He was standing in a small antechamber. To his left, a large electrical breaker box hung on the wall, its metal door hanging open. To his right, a heavy steel door stood slightly ajar. He moved toward the breaker box, noticing that the thick black cables leading out of it disappeared directly into the bedrock. With a gloved hand, he threw the massive main switch. Deep within the walls, a series of heavy mechanical clunks echoed, followed by the low electrical whine of large generators waking up. Row after row of caged fluorescent lights flickered to life overhead, casting a harsh, pale yellow glow down a long, impossibly wide corridor. Thomas stepped through the steel door and stopped, staring down the tunnel. The corridor stretched for at least 200 feet, driving straight into the subterranean heart of the mountain. It was wide enough to drive a small truck through. The sheer cost and logistical nightmare of excavating and pouring this much concrete in secret decades ago was unfathomable. Elias Vance could never have funded or built this alone. It was a military-grade installation hidden beneath a rotting wooden farmhouse. As Thomas walked slowly down the corridor, his footsteps echoing flatly against the walls, he noticed a series of identical metal doors lining the right side of the tunnel. He approached the first one, finding it unlocked. He pushed it open and shined his light inside, though the overhead fluorescence soon buzzed on. The room was not a storage closet or a utility space. It was set up exactly like a child's bedroom from the 1970s. There was a small wooden bed with a faded quilt, a dresser, and a small desk. But the unsettling details quickly became apparent. The furniture was bolted tightly to the floor, the walls were lined with thick, gray acoustic dampening foam, and high in the corner of the ceiling, a heavy glass dome housed a mechanical security camera, its lens pointed directly at the bed. Thomas backed out of the room, his breath catching in his throat. He checked the second door. It was an exact replica of a vintage kitchen, complete with a table, chairs, and old appliances. Again, everything was bolted to the concrete, the walls were soundproofed, and a camera watched from above. The appliances were completely gutted, the refrigerator had no motor, the oven had no heating elements, they were mere props. This was not a bunker designed to keep people safe from a nuclear attack. It was an observation facility. It was an enclosure designed to simulate a normal environment while closely monitoring whoever or whatever was kept inside. At the far end of the corridor, the tunnel opened up into a larger, circular command center. Banks of ancient, dusty electronic equipment sat dormant on long metal tables. Dust motes drifted lazily through the stale, warm air. In the center of the room sat a heavy steel desk with a single, leather-bound logbook resting squarely on its surface. Thomas approached the desk, his heart hammering against his ribs. He opened the ledger. The pages were filled with meticulous, handwritten notes dating back to 1982. The early entries discussed structural integrity, seismic monitoring, and depth excavation. But as he turned the pages, jumping forward through the years, the tone of the writing shifted. An entry from October of 1997 read, "The localized tremors have increased in frequency. It is testing the eastern boundary of the enclosure. We have increased the concrete density by 3,000 pounds per square yard, but the audio sensors indicate it is still moving through the porous limestone." An entry from April of 2003 was written in a hurried, frantic scrawl. It read, "The mimicry behavior is worsening. It arranged the mock furniture to perfectly match the upstairs living room. It knows the layout of the house. We cannot let it reach the surface layer." Thomas felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He looked up from the book. At the very back of the command center, set deep into the curved concrete wall, was a final door. It was different from the others. It was a massive, circular blast door resembling the entrance to a bank vault, complete with a heavy rotating locking wheel. Set at eye level in the center of the steel was a small, thick observation window made of layered quartz glass. The wheel was turned to the locked position, but the thick steel locking bolts were straining, slightly bent outward, as if something of unimaginable weight had been pressing against the door from the other side. Drawn by a morbid, terrifying curiosity, Thomas walked slowly toward the blast door. The ambient warmth in the room was coming entirely from the metal surface of this door. The vibration he had felt upstairs in the cellar was infinitely stronger here, thrumming up through his legs and rattling the teeth in his jaw. It was not a mechanical vibration. It felt organic. It felt like the slow, rhythmic breathing of something impossibly massive resting just behind the steel. He stepped up to the quartz glass window and peered through. At first, he saw only absolute blackness. It was a dark so complete it seemed to absorb the light from the room behind him. He pressed his face closer to the glass, cupping his hands around his eyes to block out the glare. As his eyes adjusted, he realized the blackness was not empty space. It was a physical surface pressed flush against the other side of the glass. It looked like dark, leathery skin covered in fine, ash-colored scales. As he watched, frozen in terror, the surface slowly slid downward, revealing a pale, milky expanse beneath it. It was an eye. An eye the size of a dinner plate, devoid of any pupil or iris, glowing faintly in the pitch black of the cavern beyond. The pale eye fixed entirely on Thomas. The deep, rhythmic vibration abruptly stopped. For a terrible, suspended second, the absolute silence of the underground facility was deafening. Then, a new sound began. It was a soft, wet tapping against the inside of the thick glass. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm perfectly matched the frantic, terrified beating of Thomas's own heart. The massive blast door groaned, the steel hinges shrieking as the immense pressure on the other side suddenly increased. The bent locking bolts shifted forward another fraction of an inch, shedding a rain of rust flakes onto the concrete floor. Thomas broke away from the door, his mind entirely consumed by blind panic. He abandoned the logbook, abandoned his heavy flashlight on the desk, and ran. He sprinted back down the impossible corridor, his boots slipping on the dusty concrete, ignoring the empty observation rooms that now felt like open mouths waiting to swallow him. He reached the bottom of the shaft and threw himself at the ladder. He climbed with reckless, desperate speed, tearing the skin from his knuckles against the rusted iron rungs, not daring to look down into the dark he was leaving behind. The heat of the shaft seemed to rise with him, carrying the faint, terrible sound of bending steel echoing up from the depths. He hauled himself out of the cellar hole, his lungs burning, and slammed the heavy iron hatch shut behind him. He did not have the padlocks to secure it. He dragged heavy wooden crates, broken furniture, and a rusted anvil over the hatch, piling hundreds of pounds of debris over the metal before sprinting up the cellar stairs and out of the house. He threw his tools into the back of his truck, started the engine, and tore down the dirt logging road, sliding wildly around the curves until he finally hit the pavement of the highway. He did not stop driving until he was 3 counties away. Thomas never filed his official appraisal. He sent a brief, vague email to the out-of-state trust, citing severe structural hazards and toxic black mold, and refused to accept any payment for his time. According to county zoning records, the property was quietly seized by the state less than 2 weeks later under an obscure environmental protection mandate. No official explanation was ever released to the public. However, hunters and locals who frequent the deep woods along Highway 39 have whispered strange stories in the years since. They claim that shortly after the property was condemned, a convoy of unmarked heavy-duty cement trucks drove up the logging road in the dead of night. They poured thousands of gallons of concrete directly into the foundation of the old house, sealing whatever lay beneath it under a solid, impenetrable cap of stone. Yet, on still windless nights in late autumn, residents living in the valleys miles away claim they can sometimes feel a low, rhythmic thrumming deep in the earth. A vibration that pauses, changes tempo, and slowly seems to learn the sleeping patterns of the towns resting above it. The Butcher of Kingsbury Run. During the bleakest years of the Great Depression, the city of Cleveland, Ohio, was a place defined by towering industrial smokestacks and grinding poverty. Beneath the iron bridges and roaring tracks of the Erie Railroad lay a jagged, overgrown ravine known as Kingsbury Run. It was a miserable scar of earth choked with soot, weeds, and the constant bitter wind coming off Lake Erie. For the thousands of transient men and women riding the rails looking for work, Kingsbury Run offered a desperate sanctuary. It was a sprawling shantytown of makeshift tents, cardboard shacks, and forgotten souls. It was a place where desperate people came to disappear, and in the shadows of the 1930s, someone realized that it was also the perfect place to hunt. The horror began subtly, with a grim discovery on the shores of Lake Erie in September of 1934. The lower half of a woman's torso washed up on the sand. The skin was strange, tough, and discolored, treated with an unidentified chemical that burned the flesh to the texture of leather. Her head was never found. Her identity remained a ghost. She became known only as the Lady of the Lake, an isolated tragedy in a city numb to misfortune. But she was not an isolated incident. She was the prologue to a macabre tapestry of violence that would soon paralyze the entire region. In September of 1935, 2 teenage boys were walking through the tangled weeds of Kingsbury Run when they stumbled upon a nightmare. Hidden in the brush were the bodies of 2 men. One was later identified as Edward Andrassy, a 28-year-old drifter known to frequent the dangerous edges of the city. The other man remained nameless. Both victims had been completely emasculated. Both had been cleanly, deliberately decapitated. The horror of Kingsbury Run did not lie in chaotic violence, but in the chilling clinical silence of the aftermath. When the medical examiners analyzed the remains, they discovered something that sent a wave of absolute dread through the police department. The bodies had been drained entirely of blood. The decapitations were not the frenzied hacking of a madman in an alleyway. They were precise surgical disarticulations of the cervical vertebrae. The killer had taken his time. He possessed undeniable anatomical knowledge. Even more terrifying was the logistical reality of the crime. To hang a human being upside down, bleed them completely dry without leaving a trace at the dump site, and sever their limbs with such immaculate precision required a private, secure location. It required a slaughterhouse. Somewhere in the crowded, bustling city of Cleveland, a butcher was operating a secret laboratory of death. As the months bled into 1936, the nightmare escalated. The killer preyed on the invisible class of society, the drifters, sex workers, and runaway teenagers whose absences would go unrecorded by the authorities. Parts of bodies began appearing in horrifying configurations across the city. Florence Polillo, a woman who lived on the margins, was found carefully dismembered, her limbs wrapped tightly in old newspapers and packed into baskets. In the summer of that same year, the headless body of a transient was found near the railroad tracks. Even with 6 distinct, elaborate tattoos across his skin, nobody stepped forward to claim him. He became known simply as the Tattooed Man, another nameless specimen on the killer's slab. The butcher of Kingsbury Run began to taunt the city. He scattered the pieces of his victims in plain sight. Heads were found wrapped in burlap sacks, abandoned under bridges. Torsos were discovered floating in the murky, polluted waters of the Cuyahoga River. Some remains showed signs of extreme hesitation and jagged cuts, while others displayed the smooth, confident slices of a master surgeon. Sometimes the bodies were scrubbed immaculate, devoid of any hair or debris. The sheer physical strength required to transport a heavy, dead torso down the steep, muddy embankments of the ravine in the dead of night was staggering. The killer was a phantom, moving unseen through the smoke and fog, carrying his gruesome cargo right under the noses of the citizens. The terror reached such a fever pitch that the city turned to a legend for salvation. Eliot Ness, the famous federal agent who had famously battled Al Capone in Chicago, had recently been appointed as Cleveland's safety director. Ness brought a reputation of untouchable justice, vowing to clean up the corruption and the crime that choked the city's streets. But the butcher did not operate in the world of organized crime. He did not care about badges, headlines, or the law. He operated in a dark, primal realm that the brilliant detective could not penetrate. Ness threw the full weight of his authority at the case. He organized massive sweeps of the shantytowns, detectives interviewed thousands of citizens, fingerprints were taken from transients, and the plaster death masks of the unidentified victims were displayed in public exhibitions, their vacant eyes pleading with the crowds for a name. But the silence remained absolute. The killer left no fingerprints, no murder weapons, and no witnesses. The roaring trains of the Erie Railroad swallowed any screams, and the soot of Kingsbury Run buried any footprints. By August of 1938, the butcher's confidence mutated into pure arrogance. In a silent, devastating declaration of supremacy, the killer deposited the dismembered remains of 2 victims in a trash dump located directly in the line of sight of Eliot Ness's office window. It was a personal insult. It was a message written in human remains, proving that no matter how powerful the law believed itself to be, the butcher owned the shadows of Cleveland. Driven to the edge of despair and realizing he was fighting an invisible monster, Ness made a controversial and desperate decision. He determined that if he could not catch the predator, he would destroy the hunting ground. In the early hours of the morning, just days after the final bodies were discovered, Ness led a massive police raid into the heart of Kingsbury Run. Officers dragged the freezing, terrified vagrants from their makeshift homes, forcing them out of the ravine. Then, under Ness's direct orders, they poured kerosene over the tents, the shacks, and the garbage. They struck matches. The resulting inferno consumed Kingsbury Run. Flames leapt into the smog-choked sky, burning the shantytown to ash. It was a heavy-handed, brutal act that displaced hundreds of destitute people who had nowhere else to go. The fire sterilized the ravine, turning the sprawling encampment into a smoldering, blackened wasteland. It was an act of profound frustration, the desperate thrashing of a lawman who had finally met an evil he could not arrest. The burning of Kingsbury Run marked the end of the official murders. The headless bodies stopped appearing in the weeds, but the closure was an illusion. The butcher was never caught. The city's primary suspect was an incredibly intelligent, deeply disturbed surgeon with a history of severe mental instability. Ness interrogated the doctor relentlessly in a hotel room for days, pushing for a confession, but the evidence was entirely circumstantial. Knowing the law could not touch him without proof, The surgeon voluntarily committed himself to an asylum, placing himself safely beyond the reach of the police. From the quiet security of his institutionalized life, he allegedly spent the next several years sending cryptic, mocking postcards to Eliot Ness, ensuring the famous detective would never forget his ultimate failure. The Great Depression eventually faded, and the ashes of Kingsbury Run were swallowed by modern development. But the heavy, suffocating dread of the unsolved case never truly lifted from the city. Out of 12 officially recognized victims, only 2 were ever definitively identified. The rest remained nameless, their meticulously severed remains buried in Potter's Fields. Somewhere in the 1930s, a man with the hands of a surgeon and the mind of a monster packed up his secret laboratory and walked quietly back into society, taking the answers with him. All that remains are the plaster casts of the forgotten faces, staring blindly from archive shelves, forever waiting for the names that the butcher took away. The Silence of the Villisca House. The town of Villisca, Iowa, in the early summer of 1912 was a place defined by its predictability. It was a thriving agricultural hub, a tight-knit community where front doors were rarely locked, and the rhythm of life was dictated by the sun and the ringing of the church bell. On the surface, the evening of June 9th was no different from any other. The air was thick with the humid weight of a Midwestern summer, the kind of heat that lingers long after the sun has set, drawing insects to the warm glow of porch lamps. On East 2nd Street, a white 2-story frame house sat quietly in the gathering dusk. It was the home of Josiah Moore, a successful local businessman, his wife Sarah, and their 4 young children. But on this particular Sunday, the house was not entirely empty. Even though the family was away, someone was already inside. The Moore family had spent the evening at the local Presbyterian church attending the annual Children's Day exercises. Sarah Moore had co-directed the program, and all of her children, 11-year-old Herman, 10-year-old Catherine, 7-year-old Boyd, and 5-year-old Paul had participated. They were accompanied by 2 neighborhood friends, 12-year-old Lena Stillinger and her 8-year-old sister Ina, who had been invited to spend the night. It was a joyous, exhausting evening of recitations and hymns. While the children sang in the crowded, brightly lit sanctuary, their home stood in deep shadow, silently harboring a trespasser. Police investigations would later reveal the chilling truth of those empty hours. Sometime during the late afternoon or early evening, while the house was unoccupied, a figure walked through the unlocked front door. They did not ransack the drawers or search for silver. They simply found a place to hide. They climbed the narrow stairs, maneuvering into the cramped, unfinished attic space located in the upper reaches of the house. The true horror of the Villisca tragedy does not merely lie in the bloodshed that followed, but in the agonizing, suffocating hours of anticipation. To understand the terror is to picture that dark, unventilated attic on a hot June night. The temperature under the sloping roof would have been stifling, the stagnant air thick with dust, and the smell of dry timber. Yet, the intruder remained completely still. They sat on the rough wooden joists, enveloped in absolute darkness, gripping a heavy axe. It was Josiah Moore's own axe, likely retrieved from the backyard before the killer slipped inside. 2 cigarette butts were later found near a slight depression in the floorboards, a quiet testament to the killer's unnerving patience. He sat there, smoking in the dark, listening and waiting. Around 9:30 p.m., the sound of footsteps on the front porch shattered the silence. The heavy wooden door swung open, letting in the warm night air and the overlapping voices of 6 tired, happy children. From the pitch blackness of the attic, the intruder could hear everything. The muffled thud of Sunday shoes being kicked off, the clinking of glass and porcelain as Sarah Moore served the children milk and a plate of cookies, the low, comforting murmur of Josiah's voice as he spoke to his wife. The floorboards of the Moore house were thin. To the man crouching in the attic, the family was painfully close. He could track their movements by the creaking wood beneath his feet. He listened as the children washed their faces, their laughter drifting up through the plaster ceiling. He listened as Josiah and Sarah moved about the parlor, performing the mundane, intimate rituals of closing up the house for the night. They felt entirely safe. They were completely unaware that death was suspended just inches above their heads, holding its breath. Slowly, the noises began to change. The energetic chatter faded into sleepy whispers. The two Stillinger girls, Lena and Ina, settled into the guest bed in the downstairs parlor. Josiah and Sarah climbed the stairs to their bedroom on the second floor. The four more children went to their respective beds down the hall. The warm glow of the oil lamps was extinguished one by one, plunging the house into deep, heavy darkness. Now began the most agonizing phase of the killer's vigil. He did not strike immediately. He understood the delicate rhythm of human sleep. He knew that the initial descent into slumber is fragile, easily broken by a sudden creak or a shifting shadow, and so he waited in the suffocating heat of his hiding place. He waited for the house to cool down. He waited for the quiet rustling of cotton sheets to cease. He waited with a predator's discipline until the collective breathing of 8 people slowed, deepened, and fell into the steady, rhythmic cadence of profound, vulnerable sleep. Midnight passed. The town of Villisca was dead to the world. Inside the house on East 2nd Street, the silence was absolute, save for the soft sound of air filling sleeping lungs. In the attic, the unseen watcher finally moved. He gathered his weapon, he shifted his weight off the wooden joists, his muscles undoubtedly stiff from hours of motionless waiting. Slowly, meticulously, he descended the narrow attic stairs. The darkness of the house was absolute, but he moved with a chilling sense of purpose. He did not immediately go to the bedrooms. Instead, he engaged in a bizarre, methodical preparation that would baffle investigators for decades. He found pieces of clothing and linens in the dark. He draped them over the mirrors in the house. He hung cloth over the glass panels of the doors. He systematically covered every reflective surface, ensuring that neither he nor his victims would have to look upon the work he was about to do. He carried a heavy slab of iron and wood. The axe blade was sharp, but he turned it around in his hands, opting for the blunt, crushing flat of the axe head. He moved toward the master bedroom first. Josiah and Sarah Moore were deeply asleep. The killer approached Josiah's side of the bed. He raised the axe high above his head in the pitch-black room, the heavy iron catching whatever faint starlight bled through the drawn curtains. He brought it down with devastating force. He struck Josiah, then Sarah, moving with a fluid, mechanical rhythm that offered no chance for screams. The parents died in their beds, swallowed by the dark before they could even open their eyes to the nightmare. Leaving the master bedroom, the shadow moved down the hall. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul lay in their beds, their small chests rising and falling under their blankets. The killer moved from bed to bed. The heavy, wet thud of iron on bone was the only sound in the house. There was no struggle, there was no waking, just the relentless, sweeping arc of the axe in the suffocating blackness. 6 lives had been extinguished on the second floor, but the intruder was not finished. He gripped the bloodied handle of the axe and descended the main staircase to the first floor. In the parlor, 12-year-old Lena and 8-year-old Ina Stillinger were asleep in the guest bed. Perhaps a loose floorboard creaked. Perhaps the heavy, sudden scent of copper in the air disturbed her. Investigators later found chilling evidence that Lena, the oldest of the children, might have briefly awakened in the dark. She was found lying crosswise on the bed, a defensive posture, a desperate and futile attempt to shield herself from the descending shadow. It was over in moments. With 8 bodies lying motionless in the dark, the killer's grim ritual continued. He moved through the silent rooms, taking pieces of clothing from the dressers. He carefully draped the garments over the ruined faces of his victims, hiding them from the world. He took a 2-pound slab of uncut bacon from the icebox in the kitchen and placed it on the floor in the guest bedroom alongside a piece of a keychain. He drew the window shades tight. He filled a bowl with water, washed his hands at the kitchen table, and left the bloody water behind. Finally, he locked the front door from the inside, took Josiah's keys, stepped out into the cool pre-dawn air, and vanished into the night. The morning of June 10th broke bright and clear. By 7 o'clock, the neighborhood was beginning to stir. Mary Peckham, an elderly woman who lived next door to the Moores, stepped out onto her porch to hang laundry. She noticed a strange, heavy stillness about the house next door. There were no children playing in the yard. The chickens had not been fed. The morning chores were entirely abandoned. The house was locked tight, the shades drawn all the way down to the sills. By 8 o'clock, her mild concern had turned to a gnawing dread. Mary called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. Ross arrived shortly after with a spare key. He unlocked the front door and stepped into the dim, quiet parlor. The air inside was thick, smelling heavily of copper and voided bowels. He called out into the gloom. There was no answer. He pushed open the door to the downstairs guest room and saw the dark, rust-colored stains soaking through the bedsheets and the unnatural stillness of the two little girls. Ross Moore stumbled out of the house, his face ashen, and told Mary to call the marshal. Within hours, the entire town of Villisca would know that the unimaginable had happened. The house was descended upon by law enforcement, doctors, and a horrified, panic-stricken public. They found the covered mirrors, they found the basin of bloody water, they found the 8 bodies, completely unrecognizable, their faces shattered and hidden beneath bloody clothes. And when they finally climbed into the suffocating heat of the attic, they found the 2 cigarette butts. They found the slight depression in the dust where a man had sat for hours. Something was always standing outside his door in Chicago. The first time the camera caught it, the hallway light outside his door had already gone dim, and the screen in the security office showed only a washed-out corridor with peeling paint, a crooked runner rug, and the narrow strip of shadow where apartment 12B began. Then something passed across the bottom of the frame. Not a person, not clearly, just a movement that bent the light for a second, as if someone tall had leaned close to the door and then withdrawn before the shape could fully form. By morning, the tenant had already filed another complaint. He had done that several times before. The management office kept them in a paper folder with the corners curling inward from use. Noise in the hallway after midnight, slow footsteps stopping outside his apartment. A soft knock with no one there when he looked through the peephole. Once, the written note said he had heard breathing. Not on the other side of the door exactly, but close enough to make the wood feel thin. The building manager had written the same answer more than once in the margin. No one observed, no evidence found. It was an old building on the north side of Chicago, one of those heavy brick apartment blocks raised when hallways were made narrow and ceilings were made high, as though the people who designed them expected the dark to settle overhead and stay there. The radiators hissed in winter like something irritated in the walls. The front vestibule smelled faintly of wet wool, rust, and old letters. Tenants came and went without speaking much. They shared elevators, laundry rooms, thin walls, and the private certainty that strange sounds were part of the place. No one remembered exactly when the complaints about the hallway began. Some said it started after a leak on the 3rd floor when the plaster had been opened and repaired and the corridor lights flickered for weeks afterward. Some said it had been happening for much longer, only no one had written it down before. But the tenant in apartment 12B, a quiet man in his late 30s who kept a regular schedule and rarely brought visitors upstairs, became the one who reported it most often. At first, he sounded embarrassed. He told the manager he knew how it would seem. Old building, pipes knocking, other tenants coming home late, he worked long hours, and maybe he was too tired. But he had begun waking a little after 3 o'clock in the morning to the feeling that someone was standing outside his door, not knocking, not moving, just waiting there. He said the feeling would drag him awake before any sound did. Then, after a minute or two, he would hear a soft scrape in the hall, like the sole of a shoe turning slowly in place. The manager checked more than once. Each time, the corridor was empty. Then, another tenant on the same floor mentioned it in passing near the mailboxes. She did not make it formal. She only said she had stepped out late one night to throw away a bag of trash and thought she saw someone standing at the far end of the hall facing the wall beside apartment 12B. When the elevator opened behind her and she glanced back, the figure was gone. She laughed when she told it, but the laugh had a careful sound to it, as if she wanted the story to end before it had properly begun. After that, the complaints were taken a little more seriously. The manager reviewed the entrance logs. No forced entry, no sign of trespassing, no one sleeping in the stairwell. She asked the evening doorman whether he had seen anyone lingering on the floor. He said no. She reminded tenants not to let strangers inside. For a week or so, the building returned to its usual sounds. Footsteps, plumbing, doors closing gently at midnight, wind along the window seams. Then, the tenant in 12B called the emergency line for the building just before dawn and said someone had crouched outside his door long enough to block out the light underneath. When the manager arrived, he would not open right away. She heard the deadbolt turn, then the chain, then silence, then his voice asking whether she was alone. He looked gray and exhausted when he finally let her in. He had not slept. He pointed to the thin band of light at the bottom of the door and said it had gone dark for several seconds, then returned, then gone dark again, as if someone were shifting their feet inches away. He had checked the peephole, he said, and seen nothing but the warped yellow of the hallway bulb. Yet, while he stood there, a slow pressure came against the other side of the door. Not pounding, not enough to rattle the frame, just a steady, deliberate lean. The kind that made the metal chain give a little click against the wood. The manager found no one outside, but that morning she requested access to older security cameras stored in the basement office, including the one aimed at the far end of the 12th floor corridor. The camera had a poor angle. It could not see the full front of apartment 12B, only part of the hallway leading toward it and a wedge of wall opposite the door. The footage from most nights was useless. Empty corridor, flickering light, static bloom, the occasional tenant passing through with groceries or laundry. But on several nights, always in the same quiet hours, between deep night and first morning traffic, something interrupted the frame. It never appeared all at once. One clip showed the shadow arriving before anything else, long and narrow, stretching across the opposite wall as if cast by a body standing just out of view. But there was no visible source for it. Another clip showed what might have been the edge of a sleeve or the side of a coat, a dark vertical line entering the frame and then slipping back again in a motion too smooth to look natural. On another, the image grain rose sharply and a pale blur crossed close to the lens, followed by a faint tremor in the picture, though the hallway itself remained empty. The manager copied several clips to show the board. A maintenance worker watched them and said it was probably a camera fault. A resident on the second floor said maybe it was a prank. Someone else suggested a tenant avoiding the lens on purpose, but no one could explain why the movement never resolved into a full body, not even for a second. There were moments when the corridor brightness changed, moments when the rug seemed slightly depressed near the edge of the frame, moments when the door to 12B looked as though someone stood before it, but no person ever stepped completely into view. The tenant asked to move units. Management said nothing was available. He stopped sleeping in the bedroom after that. The bedroom wall shared a line with the hallway, and he said he could hear too much through it once he started listening. Not voices exactly, more like careful adjustments. Cloth brushing plaster, the faintest click near the brass numbers on the door. He began falling asleep on the couch with the television on low volume, then jerking awake each time the elevator cables sighed through the shaft. A week later, the woman across the hall noticed something else. Every morning, just outside 12B, the runner rug was slightly out of line. It was an old rug, thin from years of shoes and cartwheels, with a border pattern worn almost white. The building cleaner straightened it during the day. By the next morning, the far corner near his door would be bent back again, not by much, just enough to reveal a sliver of floor beneath. At first, it looked accidental. Then she realized it was always the same corner, always folded toward the door, as if someone standing there had worried the rug edge with the side of a shoe for a very long time. The tenant began placing a chair beneath the knob at night. He also taped a strip of thin paper across the crack between the door and the frame, low enough that it would tear if anyone pushed inward. In the mornings, the paper remained intact, but the tape was often puckered and loose, as though damp breath had gathered against it for hours. He showed this to the manager. She said the hallway was drafty. He did not argue. He only looked past her shoulder into the corridor while she spoke. His friends noticed the change in him before the building did. He missed calls. He stopped going out after work. He started having groceries delivered, then stopped answering the buzzer until the driver had gone and the lobby was quiet again. The circles under his eyes deepened. Once, while speaking to a coworker in the parking lot behind the office, he said he knew how it sounded, but whatever was outside the apartment seemed to know when he was awake. That was the first detail that made the story spread through the building. He had tested it, he said. One night, he left the television on and all the lamps lit, then sat just inside the bedroom doorway without moving. Nothing happened. Another night, he turned off every light, lay in bed fully dressed, and kept his eyes open in the dark. A little after 3 a.m., the sound came. One footstep, then another. Then the long stillness outside the door. When he rose and crossed the apartment, the sound on the other side shifted too, adjusting to his movement as though following the position of his body through the walls. The manager did not like hearing this from tenants in the lobby. She told people not to encourage rumors. The board was already tired of discussing the footage, and the building had enough ordinary problems without adding something shapeless to the list. Yet, even those who mocked it began hurrying slightly as they passed the 12th floor corridor at night. A delivery driver claimed the elevator had opened there once by itself, and he had seen, at the very end of the hall, a figure standing too close to one of the doors, head bent at an angle that did not look comfortable. Before the doors could part fully, the elevator had closed again. Winter tightened around the city, the windows in the stairwell frosted at the edges, steam clanged through the old radiators. The tenant in 12B started spending weekends with his brother in another neighborhood, but he always returned for work, and each time he came back, he stood in the hallway before unlocking the apartment as though listening for something on the other side. One evening, he found a faint smear on the paint beside the peephole, gray and powdery, as if someone had rested a forehead there and left old dust behind. He wiped it away. The next morning, it had returned, a little lower. Management finally arranged for a second camera, this one installed farther down the hall to capture more of the doorway. The board wanted proof one way or the other. Trespasser, prank, defect, anything that could be named and fixed. The new camera was sharper, better lit, less forgiving. For 2 nights, it recorded nothing unusual. On the third night, a little after 3:40 a.m., the image changed. The hallway remained empty. The light over 12B hummed faintly. Then the sensor compensated, darkening the whole corridor for an instant, as though something had entered the frame without reflecting properly. When the brightness returned, there was a disturbance near the tenant's door. Not a body, more like a portion of one, a density that displaced the air. The brass numerals on the door became harder to see. The shadow line along the frame thickened. The rug corner slowly lifted, then settled. The most unsettling part came seconds later. The tenant opened the door from inside, only a few inches at first. The chain was on, a slice of warm apartment light cut into the hall. From the angle of the camera, his face was not visible, only one hand on the edge of the door and the pale rectangle of light widening. He seemed to look out. He did not move for several seconds. Then the door slammed shut so violently the camera shook. When management reviewed the footage with him the next day, he became agitated and said the video was wrong. He insisted he had not opened the door at all. According to him, he had stood in the dark with his hand near the knob, listening to something breathe softly on the other side, but he had never turned it. He said he would have remembered. The chain had still been in place when morning came, the chair had still been under the knob, yet there he was on the screen, opening the door to a hallway where no one could be seen. The board suggested stress, lack of sleep, a partial waking state. He stared at the paused image of his own hand in the doorway and said nothing. After that, he began covering the inside peephole with tape. He said he had started noticing movement in it before the sounds began, not outside the door, but inside the lens itself, like a blink where no eye should have been. When he removed the tape once to check, he found the outer glass fogged over from the hallway side. That should not have been possible in the dry winter air. He put the tape back and never took it off again. A few tenants moved out that season for unrelated reasons, but in the building's retelling, it all blurred together. A couple on the 10th floor left after a boiler issue. A graduate student on the 12th sublet her place after saying she was tired of the elevator stopping where she had not pressed it. Rumors stitched these things into one fabric. People began referring to the corridor outside 12B with a careful change of tone, the way neighbors sometimes speak around a subject they have already decided not to examine too closely. Then, the tenant vanished from the building for 3 nights in a row. Management assumed he had gone to his brother's place again. Packages accumulated in the lobby, his mailbox filled. On the 4th day, he reappeared looking calmer than anyone had seen him in weeks. He told the manager he had rented a hotel room downtown to sleep. He had spent 2 full nights there without interruption. No footsteps, no darkening under the door, no presence waiting in the hall. She asked why he had come back. He said, after a pause, that the last morning in the hotel, he had found a faint indentation in the carpet outside his room, right where someone might have stood for a long while without knocking. That afternoon, he gave notice. He packed over the next several days, always in daylight, with the apartment door propped open while friends carried out boxes. Nothing unusual happened then. The corridor looked ordinary. The air smelled faintly of bleach from a recent mopping. People passing by nodded, embarrassed perhaps by how relieved they were to see normal movement in that part of the floor. He handed back his keys before sunset and left the building without turning around. The unit remained vacant for nearly a month. During that time, the complaints stopped completely. No one heard footsteps outside the empty apartment. No camera captured any strange movement. The runner rug lay flat each morning. The manager allowed herself to think the whole thing had been a human problem after all. Something centered on one exhausted tenant and an old building ready to echo whatever fear was brought into it. Then a new renter moved in. He was younger, stayed up late, worked from home, and knew nothing about the stories except that the building was cheap for the neighborhood and the hallway lights were unreliable. For the first week, everything seemed fine. On the 8th night, the security office recorded a brief disturbance near his door. Not much. Only a thinning of the image, like heat passing in front of glass. The next morning, he asked maintenance whether the floor outside his apartment had always been so cold. He said the boards near the threshold felt like stone through his socks, even when the radiators were hissing. No one told him the rest. The second complaint came 2 days later. He said someone had been standing outside late at night, maybe a neighbor, drunk or confused, but whenever he looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. He laughed about it. He said the weird part was that he could still hear the floorboards answer tiny shifts of weight just beyond the door. By the end of the week, he had bought a small camera of his own and set it on a shelf facing the entryway from inside the apartment. The recording was later shared among tenants in fragments, passed phone to phone in the laundry room and in whispers near the mailboxes. Most of it showed nothing. A dim apartment, kitchen light off, living room washed with the glow of street lamps through blinds. Then, sometime deep in the night, the metal knob began to tremble so slightly the movement might have been missed if the viewer blinked. After that, the line of darkness beneath the door vanished, not all at once, but in sections, as if something outside were lowering itself very slowly until it lay flush against the wood. No sound came through the recording. The new tenant moved out before the month was over. Years passed and the building changed owners. The lobby was repainted, the old runner rugs were replaced. Cameras were upgraded again and again until the hallways looked too clear, too bright, stripped of the shadows that once helped stories survive. Some records were lost, some were thrown out. The folder of complaints was said to have disappeared during an office cleanout. Most people who still mention the story do so uncertainly, attaching it to different floors, different winters, different apartment numbers, but a few details remain stubborn. Tenant reports in the old building did describe repeated sightings in the hallway. Security footage did show movement outside one particular door without ever fully revealing a person. At least one resident is said to have opened the door on camera while later insisting he never touched it. And according to those who still lived there long enough to compare notes, whatever stood in the corridor was never seen arriving by elevator, never seen using the stairs, and never caught in full view under proper light. It was always at the edge of the frame, always where the camera could not quite finish its work. And in the oldest version of the story, the one repeated softly by a former tenant who claimed he heard it from the night doorman, there was one final detail that never made it into any complaint. On certain winter mornings, before the cleaners came through, the paint beside that door would carry a faint oval mark at the height of a human face, as though someone had been leaning there for hours in absolute stillness, listening to the breathing inside. When the building was renovated, that section of wall was sanded, primed, and painted over in a brighter color. New numbers went up, the old door was replaced. The hallway looked cleaner after that, more finished, less willing to hold a shadow. Even so, people in the neighborhood still tell a version of it when talk drifts toward old apartment buildings and the ways they keep things. They say the reports were probably misread. The footage was probably flawed. The tenant was probably overtired, the building was probably settling. Chicago has many old corridors, many old pipes, many doors thin enough to make anyone imagine a presence on the other side. Then someone usually mentions the camera problem. Not that it captured too little, but that it captured exactly as much as it was meant to. A hallway, a door, a light, a rug, an absence where no absence should have been. And if the story is told late enough, in a room where the windows shake softly with winter wind, someone will remember one more thing. After the first tenant left, according to those who claim to have seen the last copied footage before it vanished, the camera stayed on the empty hall for several minutes. Nothing moved. The light held steady. The corridor was blank. Then, very near the lens, a shape bent inward from above, as if something tall had been standing there the whole time, looking not at the door anymore, but directly into the camera, waiting for it to understand what it had missed. The Pogo Clown's Crawlspace. The suburbs of Chicago in the 1970s were a portrait of American stability. Neatly paved streets, freshly painted fences, and the quiet assurance that hard work yielded a comfortable life. On Somerdale Avenue in Des Plaines, this ideal was embodied by a successful contractor. He was a precinct captain, a charismatic neighbor who threw lavish summer barbecues, and a man who volunteered his weekends to entertain sick children dressed as Pogo the Clown. But beneath the veneer of civic duty and neighborly warmth, beneath the very floorboards of his sprawling brick ranch house, a suffocating darkness was taking root. It did not begin with a sight or a sound. It began with a smell. At first, the odor was subtle. It was a heavy, damp presence that seemed to cling to the lower edges of the rooms. The contractor's wife would walk through her kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon and catch a faint, sickeningly sweet waft drifting up from the heating vents. It did not smell like common household garbage. It was an oily, thick scent, reminiscent of spoiled meat left too long in the sun, mixed with the chalky, bitter chemical tang of quicklime. It was the kind of smell that coats the back of the throat and settles deep in the lungs. When she questioned him, John Wayne Gacy remained perfectly calm. He did not flinch or grow defensive. With the smooth, reassuring cadence of a seasoned salesman, he offered logical explanations. The house was built on a high water table, he told her. It was simply moisture building up in the dark, unventilated earth of the crawlspace. Or perhaps, he suggested with a casual shrug, a stray cat or a rat had crawled under the foundation during a cold snap and died. To fix it, he hauled dozens of bags of powdered lime into the house, dragging them down the hallway to the small access hatch in the floor. The access hatch was a small, unassuming square of wood that led down into a claustrophobic nightmare. The crawlspace was not a basement. It was a tight, oppressive gap between the floor joists and the raw earth, offering only a few feet of clearance. A man could not stand down there. He had to crouch, dragging himself through the cold, damp mud on his hands and knees. In the absolute darkness of that cramped void, the air was entirely still, thick with the heat of decomposition. Over the years, Gacy descended into this lightless pocket of earth again and again, armed with a short-handled shovel. He carved shallow trenches into the soil, forcing limp, lifeless forms into spaces too small to hold them, folding limbs to make them fit, and burying them under a thick snowfall of corrosive lime. Above ground, the charade of normalcy continued, creating a grotesque juxtaposition that defied comprehension. In the height of summer, usually around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Gacy would host his legendary backyard barbecues. Hundreds of guests would arrive. There were local politicians, distinguished police officers, and successful business owners, all mingling under the warm afternoon sun. They drank cold beer, played horseshoes on the lawn, and laughed at Gacy's loud, boisterous jokes. Is less than hasson. Zero hash is greater than. Gacy would stand at the large outdoor grill wearing an apron, skillfully flipping burgers and steaks. The rich, savory smoke of cooking meat would billow across the yard, masking the faint, persistent odor rising from the ground below. As the guests stood on the patio, making small talk and enjoying the suburban twilight, they were completely oblivious. They were standing on a graveyard. Just inches below the soles of their expensive shoes, separated only by a thin layer of topsoil and concrete, lay the rotting remains of young men. 29 bodies were packed into the earth beneath the property, slowly dissolving into the mud while the party carried on above them. But as the years passed, the crawl space grew crowded. The earth could no longer absorb the volume of the dead. By 1977, the sickening sweetness in the house became impossible to ignore. In the dead of winter, when the bitter Illinois wind forced the family to close all the windows and turn on the furnace, the horror amplified. The heating system acted as an exhaust pipe for the tomb below. The warm air pushed the concentrated, putrid stench of mass decay up through the floor registers, filling the bedrooms, the living room, and the kitchen with the undeniable smell of death. The scent permeated the furniture. It settled into the fabric of the curtains and the fibers of the carpets. The wife burned candles constantly, leaving windows cracked open despite the freezing temperatures, desperate to scrub the foulness from her home. Gacy brought in industrial deodorizers and fans, complaining loudly about the poor drainage system. He continued to pour hundreds of pounds of lime down the hatch. He maintained his mask of irritation, acting as the frustrated homeowner dealing with a stubborn structural issue. He would put on his clown makeup, paint a wide red smile over his face, and head out to parties, leaving his family to breathe in the exhalations of his victims. The claustrophobia of the house became psychological as well as physical. The air was thick, suffocating, and heavy with an unspoken dread. Neighbors began to notice the strange, pungent odor wafting from the property when the wind blew in a certain direction. They too accepted the story of the broken sump pump and the damp earth. No one wanted to believe that the cheerful man who fixed their sidewalks and hosted their block parties was capable of anything sinister. The human mind naturally rejects the unimaginable, preferring to believe in dead rats rather than murdered boys. The illusion finally collapsed in the freezing final days of 1978. Investigators, looking into the disappearance of a local teenager, executed a search warrant on the house at 8213 Summerdale. When a detective stood in the living room, feeling the warm air blow from a heating vent, the smell hit him. It was a scent no seasoned officer could mistake for a dead animal or a moisture problem. It was the distinct, unmistakable odor of human putrefaction. They pulled up the access panel. A technician lowered himself into the dark, incredibly tight space beneath the house. The heat down there was unnatural, generated by the chemical reaction of the lime and the biological process of dozens of bodies breaking down in the soil. As the technician swept away a thin layer of dirt and white powder, his trowel struck something hard. It was not a pipe, and it was not a stone. It was a human femur. What followed was a slow, agonizing excavation. The crawl space was so heavily packed with remains that investigators struggled to tell where one trench ended and another began. The earth was saturated. The claustrophobia of the site meant officers had to work in agonizingly cramped positions, breathing through heavy masks, carefully removing the victims one by one from the dark mud. They uncovered 29 bodies in that tight, airless void beneath the floorboards, a silent congregation trapped in the dark while the world walked above them. The house was eventually demolished, erased from the manicured landscape of Summerdale Avenue. The lot was left vacant, a patch of empty grass standing in stark contrast to the identical homes surrounding it. But the memory of that suffocating house remains a permanent scar on the neighborhood. For those who lived there, who attended the parties, and who breathed the air in that living room, the horror lingers. It is the realization of how thin the floorboards truly are, and how easily a monster can hide his darkness behind a painted smile and a neighborly wave, burying his secrets in the shallow earth while the rest of the world turns a blind eye. They moved into a house in Texas that wasn't empty. The first thing they found was the warm coffee cup in the attic, set carefully on a square of newspaper that had gone soft with dust. It was still giving off a faint smell, bitter and stale, as if someone had stepped away from it only minutes before. There was no electricity connected to the upper crawl space, no furniture, no reason for anyone to be there at all, yet the cup sat upright between the rafters, beside a folded blanket and a little pile of sunflower seed shells, as neat and ordinary as a place setting. Down below, the moving truck was still open in the yard, and the last of the afternoon light was crossing the pasture behind the house. Nothing in the wide, empty land around them suggested a neighbor close enough to wander in unnoticed. Nothing in the old sale records had suggested anyone else still had a claim to the property. The house stood outside a small Texas town where roads ran flat for miles, and the fences often outlasted the names of the families who built them. It was an older place, patched and repainted so many times that its walls held different ages and layers. The deed had been messy from the beginning. The closing attorney had explained in a tired voice that there were gaps in the ownership history after an older relative died without a clear will. Some names appeared twice in county papers. Others appeared once and never again. There had been tax notices, a probate filing that seemed to stop halfway through, and an unsigned transfer copied from a much older ledger. It was not unusual in that part of the state, they were told. Land stayed in families, houses passed hand to hand, records went missing, people died, and cousins argued, and sooner or later, someone sold what could still be sold. The couple who bought it were not reckless people, they were simply tired of rent and traffic and the long fluorescent fatigue of city life. The house was cheap for what it was, and from the road, it looked almost peaceful. There was a rusted windmill behind the barn, a dry stock tank beyond it, and an oak tree leaning toward the porch as if it had spent years listening. The rooms inside were larger than expected, with high ceilings and old wooden doors that did not quite fit their frames. The boards creaked, but not in any dramatic way. They creaked like old houses always do, giving back the heat they stored in the day and settling deeper into themselves after dark. That first evening, after the cup was found, they told themselves what people usually tell themselves when a place already feels strange. The realtor had workers in and out during the week. A handyman could have left it, one of the men from the moving crew could have slipped upstairs to get out of the heat, someone might even have been using the attic while the property stood empty. Rural houses drew wanderers sometimes, teenagers, hunters, transients passing through. It was unsettling, but not impossible. They threw the cup away, opened the attic window, and tried to laugh about it over takeout eaten from cardboard containers in the kitchen. Then, sometime after midnight, the woman woke to the sound of slow footsteps above the bedroom ceiling. Not the scurry of an animal, not the scratch of branches. These were measured steps, heavy enough to press dust from the cracks overhead, moving from one end of the attic to the other and then stopping directly above the bed. The house had no central air yet, and in the stillness, every sound traveled plainly. Her husband listened too. They lay there in the dark, not speaking until the steps resumed, and went away toward the back of the house. He got up, took a flashlight from a box in the hall, and checked every room downstairs before climbing the narrow stair to the attic hatch. By then, the sound had stopped. The insulation lay undisturbed. No blanket, no newspaper, no sign of the cup except the dark ring it had left on a board. The next day brought small contradictions. A kitchen cabinet they had emptied was standing open. A roll of paper towels they had set by the sink was gone, then turned up behind canned goods in the pantry. One of the back windows, painted shut for years, seemed to have been lifted from the outside and lowered again, leaving a clean line in the dust along the sill. These things had simple explanations when taken one at a time. Unfamiliar house, stress, half-unpacked boxes, But the unease did not come from any single event. It came from the shape they made together, as if a pattern were forming at the edge of vision and never holding still long enough to be named. The older neighbors, when approached carefully, were polite in the manner of people who have learned not to say too much at first. One woman at the feed store remembered the family that had lived there before the property went into confusion. Or rather, she remembered several families connected by marriage and grief and debt in ways that were no longer clear. A man had died in the house many years earlier. Another had left after a dispute over inheritance. Someone's daughter had come back for a while and then disappeared from conversation without anyone explaining where she went. The neighbor said there had always been stories about the place not staying empty when it ought to. She said it lightly, with a small smile, the way rural people sometimes mention old rumors without wanting to sound foolish. The house, she said, had a habit of collecting strays, sometimes cats. Sometimes people. That evening, while carrying flattened boxes to the burn barrel, the husband noticed that the padlock on the old storm cellar behind the kitchen had been cut long ago and then looped back through the latch to look intact. The doors were swollen with damp and earth, difficult to open. Inside, the cellar was mostly bare. There were shelves for canned food, a broken jar, the smell of old soil and limestone. But at the far end, where the light narrowed, there was a gap in the rear wall where the concrete had been chipped away around an older foundation line. Someone had stacked loose boards over it from the inside. Behind those boards lay a narrow passage just high enough for a person to crawl through on hands and knees. They did not go all the way in. The flashlight reached only a little distance before the passage bent out of sight. Yet even from the entrance, they could see things no abandoned space should have held. A plastic grocery bag, a fork, a clean blanket, a candle burned low in a jar lid. They backed out slowly, dragging the cellar doors shut with more force than necessary. Neither of them said much while the sun went down. It seemed important, suddenly, not to let their voices carry. They called the sheriff's office the next morning. A deputy drove out in a pale truck coated with road dust and listened without much visible surprise. According to reports from other parts of the country, old houses with voids between walls, attic runs, and service spaces had occasionally hidden people for days or even months. The word for it had begun appearing in public discussions, though most people still treated it like a story told online late at night. The deputy did not use the word. He only asked where the access points were. He looked through the attic, the cellar passage, the crawl space beneath the addition, and the barn loft. He found no one. He did find wrappers tucked in the insulation, a stack of old mail not addressed to the new owners, and several little nests of living made from items taken around the house. One of the missing towels, a spoon, a church bulletin, a cheap radio without batteries. He said someone had probably been using the spaces before the sale and was now coming back when the lights were off. He advised changing the locks anyway, though both of them understood locks mattered less when a person already knew the hidden ways in and out. For 2 nights, nothing happened. They slept with a lamp on and the bedroom door closed. The quiet became almost worse than the noises had been. A quiet house asks to be trusted. By the 3rd night, they began to feel ashamed of their own fear. The deputy's search had been thorough. The locks were new, the cellar passage had been nailed shut. It was possible, they said, that the whole thing had ended. Then the dog started looking at the laundry room wall. He was an old animal and not easily excited. They had brought him from the city because he followed them from room to room and could not bear separation. In the new house, he had seemed uneasy from the first hour, but on the 4th evening, he planted himself in front of the laundry room, ears low, and began to growl at a section of wall beside the water heater. It was a soft, constant sound, more troubled than aggressive. When the husband tapped the paneling there, the sound that came back was wrong, not solid, hollow. A contractor they reached the next day confirmed that the room had once been larger and then boxed in, leaving a chase between 2 walls that ran toward the old kitchen. The panel came loose with only a pry bar and a little pressure. Behind it was a standing space no wider than a coffin turned upright. There were shelves set between studs, hooks made from bent nails, a narrow mattress folded in half, empty food tins, a transistor radio, and 3 little circles marked on the wood where candles had burned down to wax. On one shelf sat a row of objects taken from the house over the last week. The missing paper towels, a kitchen knife, a family photograph still in its moving box, her hairbrush, one of his shirts. None of it looked stolen for money. It looked selected, kept, touched. At the back of the cavity, there was a second opening, almost invisible in the shadow, leading deeper toward the heart of the house. Cool air came through it, carrying the faint scent of soap and something older beneath it, the close smell of skin trapped in stale wood. This time, the sheriff's office returned with more men. They searched for hours. The hidden route twisted through walls and dead spaces left by additions made over several decades. It connected the laundry room to a strip behind the pantry, then up by a ladder cut into framing toward the attic eaves. There were marks everywhere that suggested long use. Smoothed boards where hands had steadied themselves, cloth stuffed into openings to muffle sound, view holes no wider than coins looking into the kitchen, the hallway, and one corner of the bedroom. Yet once again, no person was found. The officers were forced to admit what the couple already knew. Whoever had been in the house understood it better than anyone living above the floorboards. By then, the story had reached the town in the incomplete, altered form such stories always take. Some said a drifter had taken shelter there. Some said a relative had never accepted the sale and was hiding in the structure to frighten the buyers out. Some remembered older local talk about a family member who had lived in the walls as a child during ugly domestic disputes, slipping through vents and service gaps to avoid a violent father. Others believed the hidden passages dated back much earlier to a time when people in isolated farmhouses used storm cellars and false walls to conceal cash, liquor, or kin they did not want county officials asking about. According to local memory, the house had gone through periods when windows opened by themselves, canned food vanished, and lights appeared in places with no power. None of this proved anything. It only deepened the sense that the new owners had entered a story that was already old when they found it. They moved most of their belongings into one locked room and kept the rest loaded in the truck. Sleep came in pieces. The husband began waking with the certainty that he was being observed from just beyond the dark. More than once, he rose and switched on the light to find nothing changed except the dog sitting rigid and facing the closet. The woman noticed that a hymn she had been humming in the kitchen one afternoon came back to her later from the attic, not sung, only tapped out in a slow rhythm above her head, as if someone had learned it by listening. One morning, she found a fresh bar of soap in the shower with a thumbprint pressed into it. They should have left then. By any sensible measure, they stayed too long. But leaving a house is not as simple as turning away from a motel room. There were loans, contracts, pride, the exhausting stubbornness that rises when people feel they are being pushed from something they paid for. They told themselves they wanted proof. They told themselves they wanted the sheriff to catch whoever was doing it. They told themselves they could not abandon the place over sounds in the walls. The final night began with rain. Not a storm, only a steady fall that darkened the pasture and filled the gutters until the whole house seemed wrapped in running water. Near midnight, the power flickered. The lamp in the bedroom went out and came back weakly. Somewhere in the passageways, something moved with sudden purpose, not the careful drifting they had grown used to, but a quick, committed motion through wood and plaster. The dog barked once and then yelped. The husband ran into the hall with a flashlight and heard a door closing at the far end of the house, though every visible door was still open. They found the dog trembling in the kitchen. The back porch door was unlatched. Mud had been tracked in across the floor, not from outside, but from the pantry, where a section of shelving now stood ajar like a mouth. Behind it, in the hidden run, the flashlight beam shook over hanging cloth, scattered tins, and a fresh footprint in damp earth. It was bare, small but not childlike, human, leading inward. They called 911 and were told deputies were on the way. Until then, they stayed together in the kitchen with the lights on and every visible entrance watched. Rain hissed outside, water dripped from the eaves. Above them, inside the walls, came the slow pressure of someone shifting weight from one board to another. The sound moved around the room in a patient circle, stopping once behind the refrigerator, then again above the sink, as though the unseen person were considering the best place to emerge. Neither of them spoke. The dispatcher kept asking questions through the phone, but her voice sounded far away, flattened by distance and static. What happened next was later described differently by everyone involved. The husband would say that he saw fingers curl briefly through the narrow gap between the pantry shelf and the frame, then vanish. The woman insisted she saw an eye looking through one of the tiny drilled holes near the ceiling, calm and unblinking in the flashlight beam. The responding deputies reported finding the shelf open and the hidden route empty once again, though one man privately admitted that he heard movement in the attic after the search had already been called off. The only thing all accounts agreed on was what they found in the bedroom closet. At the back, tucked behind hanging coats they had not unpacked yet, someone had arranged a neat stack of old documents tied with faded ribbon. They were deed fragments, probate copies, tax receipts, letters, and family notes taken from different years, some official and some handwritten. The names on them overlapped, repeated, and contradicted each other. Certain signatures matched no clear transfer. One penciled note, brittle with age, listed household expenses beside the words "still here" written in the margin. Another, much newer, bore no signature at all. It contained only a sentence on lined paper torn from a school notebook. This house was never empty. They left before dawn. The property changed hands again after that, though not quickly. According to later public discussion in the area, contractors sealed the wall voids and demolished part of the rear addition. Some believed they solved the problem. Others said the hidden spaces were too old and too complicated to erase entirely. County records were eventually straightened enough for the title to pass, but local talk never settled. People still mention a house outside town where groceries disappeared from sealed kitchens and dust shifted in attic beams on windless nights. Some say an estranged relative had been living there all along, moving through the walls to protect what she believed was still hers. Some investigators suspected a far sadder explanation, the kind that grows out of generational neglect and family collapse, where a person learns to survive inside the unused parts of a home because there is nowhere else left to go. And some residents, in the slow and careful way country people preserve uncomfortable things, simply say the old place had a watcher in it, someone who remained when families left, someone who learned the house as if it were a body and used its hollows as lungs. Years later, when the story surfaced again in retellings and late-night threads, people argued about what was true. They argued over the legality of the sale, over the missing heirs, over whether fear had magnified ordinary sounds into something monstrous. Yet the detail that stayed with those who heard it was not the hidden mattress or the coffee cup or the bare footprint in the pantry earth. It was the fact that whoever moved through those walls had apparently kept the house in order in small, intimate ways long before the buyers arrived. Windows closed before rain, food wrappers gathered into tidy stacks, old papers preserved, a blanket folded, a cup placed carefully on newspaper so it would not stain the boards, as if the person inside did not think of the place as abandoned at all. As if, in the long confusion of broken deeds and half-finished inheritances, someone had simply gone on, living there quietly, listening through the walls for new footsteps overhead, waiting for strangers to understand that buying a house and possessing it were not always the same thing. What they found in the basement in Pennsylvania wasn't supposed to be there. The first thing they noticed was the warmth. It was not much, only a shallow pocket of heat pressed against the damp cold of the basement wall in a place where no pipe should have been running and no sunlight had touched for years. The house had been empty, according to the papers tied to the sale, for so long that neighbors had stopped calling it by the family name and simply referred to it as the old place at the tree line. Its windows were gray with dust, its porch had sunk crookedly into the weeds. Even in daylight, the rooms upstairs held the stale hush of somewhere that had stopped expecting voices. Yet in the basement, behind a shelving unit swollen with rot, one section of stone felt almost body-warm when the contractor laid his palm against it. The owner had bought the property in late autumn, hoping to restore it before winter set in too hard. It was an older farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, the kind built in stages over many decades, with thick fieldstone walls below and timber additions above, patched and altered as generations needed more room. Local renovation reports on houses, like it often mentioned, root cellars, coal rooms, sealed cisterns, shallow crawl spaces under kitchens, and odd narrow voids left by older staircases or foundation changes. This house, from the beginning, seemed to have more of those spaces than it should. By the second day, the workers had already found one door hidden under paneling and another buried behind shelves in a pantry. Neither led anywhere stranger than expected. One opened to a linen recess no wider than a coffin, the other to a steep service stair descending to the basement. Houses of that age were full of forgotten practicalities. That was what one of the men said when the wall in the basement gave back that faint warmth, and everyone laughed more than the remark deserved. Then the crowbar slipped into a seam between the stones. It had been mortared over carefully, but not well enough to disappear from a patient eye. The stones along that section were older than the patch around them, darker with age, and when the bar bit in and twisted, a drift of pale mortar dust spilled down like dry ash. Behind the shelving unit, there was a vertical line, then a horizontal one. Not a wall, exactly. A fitted face. A cover. The men worked in silence after that. The sound of metal levering stone was slow and heavy, a dragging scrape followed by the soft collapse of grit onto the earth floor. When the first stone shifted, a cold draft passed over their hands. It smelled wrong. Not the sealed mineral smell of a long-closed cellar, not the sweet rot of old wood and wet dirt, but something layered and recent beneath the mildew. Smoke, faint but not ancient, damp wool, oil, and under it, the flat, unmistakable smell of a room that had been breathed in. The opening was too small at first to do more than shine a light through. The beam struck rough boards, a low ceiling, and a narrow space extending past the reach of the flashlight. One of the workers cursed softly. Another asked if there had been a floor plan. There had, but only a thin county copy and a survey that showed dimensions without much faith in their truth. Older rural homes were altered without permits more often than not. Walls were added, wells were covered. Spaces were hidden because a family needed somewhere to store winter food or liquor or something they did not want taxed or someone they did not want seen. By the time they widened the gap enough to crawl in, the owner had come down from upstairs and was standing on the basement steps with both hands in his jacket pockets as if he already regretted buying the place. The hidden room was longer than expected and lower than any of them liked. A grown person had to move through it bent at the waist. It had plank walls darkened by age, a packed dirt floor, and at the far end, a small raised platform made from boards set over old bricks. There were shelves, too, and on them a scatter of objects that should not have been there if the house had truly sat empty for years. A tin cup without much rust, a mason jar with a cloudy inch of water, a blanket folded once, not neatly, but recently enough that it had not yet taken on the shape of collapse. There were candle stubs, matches in a dry tin, a length of cord, 2 newer food cans with labels less faded than anything else in the basement, and near the platform, pressed into the dirt, marks that looked very much like the tread of a modern work boot. No one said squatters at first. That word came later in the kitchen when they stood around the table under the dead light fixture and looked at what had been carried up. The owner said maybe some teenager had gotten in here. One of the workers shook his head and said a teenager would have left wrappers, spray paint, beer cans, something careless and loud. This was different. The hidden room had the order of use. Not constant use, perhaps, but repeated. Careful. The blanket had been folded to leave room on the platform. The water jar had a cloth tied loosely over the mouth to keep dust out. Nothing in there had looked abandoned. It had looked paused. Outside, evening was already thickening around the fields. There were no nearby streetlights, only the long, dull spread of cloud over harvested land and the black firs crowding the rear edge of the property. In that light, the house seemed to withdraw into itself, each window darkening before the next. The owner asked whether they should call the sheriff. One man said they probably should. Another asked what exactly they would report. An empty room behind a wall, a blanket, some cans, a smell. In the end, they did call the non-emergency line, and an officer came out before full dark. He looked through the space, took down a few notes, and said it was impossible to say when anyone had last been there. Rural properties were hard to watch. Vacant homes drew hunters, drifters, curious kids, scavengers, sometimes people simply trying to stay out of sight for a few nights. He advised changing the locks and keeping the place secured until the work was done. He did not seem especially alarmed until one of the men mentioned the warmth in the wall. Even then, he only frowned, crouched, and shone his own light around the hidden room with a more serious patience than before. At the far end, above the platform, there was a slit in the boards. Narrow, easy to miss. It ran horizontally between two planks and had been drilled through again and again in tiny dark holes as if someone had widened a knot or made a line of peepholes no bigger than pencil erasers. The officer leaned in close. Then he asked what room sat on the other side. The kitchen. He stood up very slowly after that. When they tested it from above, the answer became worse. The hidden room was tucked beneath the rear section of the house, where no room should have existed at all, in the dead space below the kitchen pantry and part of the mudroom. The line of holes looked not into the basement, but upward through a concealed cavity toward the underside of the floorboards. Sound traveled through it. So did a thread of lamplight when they set a work light on the kitchen floor and went back below. A person in that hidden room could have listened to movement overhead. They could have heard chairs scrape back from the table, heard someone rinse a glass at the sink, heard the old floor creak under slow midnight footsteps. The officer told the owner not to stay there. That would have been reasonable advice even without the hidden room, given the state of the place, but he said it with a flatness that made everyone listen. The next morning, two of the workers refused to go back into the space unless someone stood watch outside. They laughed when they said it, but not very convincingly. They had begun demolition in the upstairs bath and were halfway through hauling plaster when one of them came down complaining of a tapping sound. Not in the walls generally, but underfoot. 3 taps, then a pause, then 2 more. They all stood still to hear it. Nothing came. The owner told them old houses knocked all the time, pipes contracted, framing settled, mice moved through the voids. The men agreed. Then one asked, without looking at anyone, why the tapping had stopped the moment all of them had gone quiet. It was later that afternoon that they found the second sign. The basement door had been left propped open for ventilation. Rain had started while they were working upstairs, and a trail of damp marks led in from the back of the house, across the basement floor, and toward the broken opening in the wall. They were not clean footprints. More like the darkened edges of them, as if wet soles had picked up cellar dust and left brief, imperfect shadows behind. There were enough to follow, and then there were none, though the dirt inside the hidden room at first showed no fresh impressions deeper than the ones already there. One of the men backed out immediately and said he was done. The officer returned, this time with another deputy. They searched the house, the attic, the crawl under the porch, the outbuildings half collapsed in the weeds, and the strip of woods behind the property where old farm trash had sunk into leaf mold over decades. They found no one. A bedroom upstairs, however, which had remained closed while the contractors worked other parts of the house, showed a detail the owner swore had not been there the day before. The dust on the bureau had been disturbed in a smooth round patch, as if a hand or bowl or lamp had rested there briefly. Beside it lay a single match, unburned, from the same old paper brand found in the hidden room. After that, the men stopped staying until dusk. Stories began in the loose way they do around isolated properties. A neighbor from farther down the road remembered hearing that one of the earlier owners had partitioned odd spaces in the cellar during Prohibition, though whether that had been for whiskey or for fear, no one could say. Another local man claimed the farmhouse had once sheltered a relative who came back from war, changed and violent and preferred small enclosed places, though he admitted he had only heard that from his father. An elderly woman in town said there had been talk, years earlier, of someone living in the walls of an abandoned house near the county line, slipping out at night for food and vanishing before dawn, but she could not say if it was the same property or merely one of those rural stories that migrate from road to road until they attach themselves wherever there is enough darkness to hold them. None of that explained the ash. It was discovered on the third evening after the wall was opened. The workers had left before sunset. The owner, against advice, had returned alone to check on tools and lock up. He found a shallow gray spill on the floor of the hidden room beside the raised platform, with one blackened twist of wick lying in it. The ash was dry. When he touched the center with a screwdriver tip, it still held a little warmth, as if a candle had burned there not long before. He left immediately and called from the truck, not willing to go back inside even for the padlock he had forgotten on the porch rail. This time, the search was more serious. More lights, more voices, mud tracked through the yard. The deputies brought a dog, but the rain that had passed over the fields had muddled the ground into a broad, wet confusion. If someone had approached on foot, there was no clear trail to follow. If they had been inside before the owner arrived, there was no certainty of when they had left. The house gave up only small things: a fresh scrape on the basement threshold, a fragment of wax, the smell of smoke lingering in the hidden room and nowhere else. One deputy asked to see the old survey again. He stood over it in the kitchen with his flashlight beam crossing the paper, then went back below and measured from foundation to foundation. His numbers did not settle right. The hidden room matched part of the missing distance, but not all of it. There appeared to be another void beyond the rear wall, narrower and deeper, inaccessible from the first. The house, in other words, contained more darkness than it admitted. No one broke that second wall that night. The owner paid for a temporary camera system instead. Motion sensors, battery lights, a portable monitor set in the truck. The installers arrived the next day and moved quickly, eager to finish before evening. One camera faced the basement stairs, another the opening in the false wall. A third was placed inside the hidden room itself, fixed on the platform and shelves. The owner told no one outside the work crew, and he did not stay on the property after dark. The footage, when it came, was less useful than it should have been. For hours, there was nothing but dust passing like pale gnats across the infrared glow. The basement stairs remained empty, the hidden room sat still, all edges and black corners. Shortly after midnight, the camera inside the room lost focus for several seconds. When the image cleared, the blanket was no longer folded. It lay spread across the platform, flattened as if something had leaned or lain on it. No movement was visible during the blur. No person crossed the frame before or after. The timestamp held steady. The battery level was normal. The technician later suggested interference, moisture, cheap equipment. He did not explain the blanket. On the next night, the camera facing the basement stairs caught sound before motion. Not a footstep exactly. A slow drag, then a pause, then another. The audio was thin and distant, but it had a careful rhythm to it, as if someone barefoot were trying not to knock against the risers. The frame showed only the lower half of the stairwell. No body descended into view, yet a shadow passed across the wall, broadening and narrowing with the shape of someone moving between the camera and the weak light from above. After that, the signal from every camera cut at once. The owner never moved into the house. That much is certain in the versions of the story that survived the work itself. Some say the restoration was abandoned within the week. Some say the basement was filled and sealed, the opening bricked over, and the rear foundation left untouched. Others insist the contractors did continue for a time, but only in daylight, and only after one of them found a spoon, recently washed clean, lying in the kitchen sink of a house no one had entered that morning. Publicly discussed accounts of vacant homes in the United States sometimes include strange evidence of hidden occupation, people living in attics, crawl spaces, basements, wall voids, or unused service areas without the owners knowing. Investigators usually settle on the living before the dead, trespassers, runaways, people hiding from warrants, weather, or other people. That explanation is always possible here. It is the one that makes the most sense. It is also the explanation that leaves the narrow listening holes under the kitchen floor, the warm ash, and the spread blanket in the camera blur exactly where they were. Years later, according to local retellings, the place still stood for a while beyond the field road, more collapsed each season, windows dark, porch gone soft with rot. Hunters avoided it. Teenagers drove out to look at it and did not stay long. One winter, a neighbor passing after sundown reportedly saw a thread of yellow light moving low behind the basement stones, not steady like electricity, but trembling, as if from a candle being carried by hand. By the time he stopped his truck and looked again, the light had gone. The property eventually changed hands. Fences came down, brush reclaimed the back lot. The house itself was said to have been partially dismantled, though no one seems to agree on how much remained and how much was simply swallowed by neglect. But the story stayed attached to that patch of Pennsylvania ground, not because anyone proved what was in the basement, and not because anyone confirmed anything supernatural, but because of one simple detail in the renovation reports and in the memory of the men who had first opened the wall. The hidden space did not feel discovered. It felt interrupted. And if the house had truly been vacant for all those years, if no one had been sleeping under the kitchen and listening through the floorboards, then there was still no comfortable reason for the folded blanket, the recent cans, the drifting warmth in the stone, or the ash that was warm to the touch in a room no one had entered before the owner opened it. There are old houses that settle, old houses that hide things, and old houses that preserve traces of the people who passed through them. Then there are houses with spaces shaped not for storage, but for waiting. In the stories told afterward, that was what unnerved everyone most. Not the possibility that someone had once hidden there, but the quieter possibility that someone had learned the house well enough to remain inside it whenever they pleased, hearing every footstep overhead, and had only stepped back into the dark while strangers broke through the wall that was never supposed to be opened. The phone that rang without a caller in Seattle. The first call came while the house was still settling into the cold, and by the time Margaret reached the hallway table, the telephone had already stopped. It left behind only the faint click of the line going dead, and the uneasy hush that follows a sound too sudden for an old place. She stood there in her robe, one hand on the receiver, listening to nothing. No dial tone at first, only a thin rush, like distant air moving through a long pipe, and under it something so brief she almost mistook it for memory, a woman drawing breath to speak. The home stood on a steep street north of the Ship Canal in a part of Seattle where the older houses leaned into the weather as if still bracing against another winter from another century. It had a high front porch, narrow stairs, and a second-floor hallway that kept its darkness even at noon. According to the woman who sold it, the place had belonged to the same family for decades. According to a neighbor who spoke in a lowered voice over a fence slick with rain, strange calls had been reported there before. Not threatening calls, not obscene ones. Only rings in the middle of the night, and when someone answered, a silence full of faint movement. The neighbor had smiled after saying it, as if embarrassed by the shape of his own story, but he did not take it back. Margaret had moved in alone after her husband died. She was not old enough to be called elderly by anyone polite, but grief had a way of making a person move more quietly through rooms, as if careful not to disturb someone still sleeping. The house suited that quiet. It held sound in odd ways. The radiators sighed. The pipes tapped behind the plaster. The cedar outside the bedroom window dragged its branches across the siding whenever the wind shifted in from the water. She had begun to learn each noise by character and by hour. The ring of the telephone was different. It cut through the house with an urgency that made the air itself seem to tighten. The second call came 3 nights later, a little after 3 o'clock in the morning. This time, she answered before the ringing finished. She expected the usual confusion of a wrong number, some tired voice asking for a stranger. Instead, she heard a room. That was the first thing she thought later when she tried to describe it. Not a voice, a room, background noise with walls around it, something hard and echoing. Footsteps or shoes striking a smooth floor. Then a burst of crackling sound, as if another receiver somewhere had been lifted in haste. She said hello twice. No one answered her. But from far away, with the flattened distance of old recordings and bad lines, came a man speaking too quickly to make out. Then a woman, sharp and frightened, saying there was smoke. Margaret froze with the receiver pressed so tightly to her ear that the skin went numb. The line went dead before she could hear anything more. In daylight, the memory seemed thinner, easier to dismiss. Seattle mornings had a way of washing the terror out of things, replacing it with wet roofs, gulls, buses working uphill, and the ordinary business of people carrying coffee beneath umbrellas. Margaret told herself that crossed lines still happened. Old systems glitched, strangers called emergency services every hour of every day. Somewhere, somehow, two moments had brushed against each other through copper and rain. Then she mentioned it to the telephone company, and the technician who came to inspect the line spent a long time in the basement with a flashlight and a spool of wire, then came back upstairs with a face too careful to be reassuring. The wiring, he said, had been altered many years earlier, then altered again, and some of it no longer matched the usual pattern for a house of that age. There had once been an extension in the upstairs back bedroom, one that no longer existed except for a dead cable inside the wall. He asked if she had other instruments connected. She told him there was only the phone in the hall. He nodded, but his gaze drifted for a moment toward the staircase, as if listening for something above them. The next week, the calls began to settle into a pattern. Not every night, never at the same hour. They arrived during heavy rain, or in the wind before dawn, or in the narrow stillness just after midnight when the house seemed to hold its breath. Sometimes no one was there at all. Sometimes she heard fragments of noise, a dispatcher asking for an address, clipped and calm, the squeal of tires, a child crying somewhere far back in the line. Once, unmistakably, the hollow clang of a stretcher striking a doorway. Each call ended before it yielded enough to become clear. Each one left behind a feeling worse than fear, recognition without memory. Margaret began keeping a notebook beside the telephone. She wrote down the time of each call in words, the weather, and whatever she thought she had heard. After the seventh call, she noticed something strange. The sound seemed old. Not old in content, because distress does not age, but old in texture. There was a grain to the voices, a muffled distance, an uneven hum beneath them, the faint metallic hiss of analog tape. She had listened to enough archived broadcasts and museum recordings to know the sound of a voice carried forward from another decade. The telephone, new enough to look ordinary, was delivering voices that seemed to belong to other equipment entirely. It was the neighbor again who told her what had happened on the street years before. He did not know the exact date. He spoke of it the way people speak of accidents that are folded into a neighborhood and remain there, half as fact, half as warning. There had been a fire in one of the older homes nearby long before most of the current residents arrived. A winter fire, he thought, started late at night, a family trapped upstairs. People in neighboring houses had phoned for help. Some said the fire crews reached the street quickly and were delayed by ice on the steep grade. Some said they were too late from the start. He could not say which house it had been, only that it was one of the old ones and that the story changed depending on who told it. He seemed relieved, after sharing that much, to drift into safer topics. Roof repairs, property taxes, moss. Margaret said nothing about the calls, but that evening she walked the second floor with a flashlight, pausing outside each closed door. The back bedroom had been empty since she moved in, except for sealed boxes and an iron bed frame left by the previous owner. It smelled of dry plaster and cedar. The window looked over the alley and the dark slope beyond it. Against the far wall, behind stacked cartons, she found a square patch in the wallpaper where something had once been mounted and later removed. Below it, close to the baseboard, a narrow hole in the plaster had been filled badly and painted over. When she pressed her thumb to it, the wall gave a little hollow behind the surface. The dead extension line, she thought. The next call came while she was standing in that room. She heard the telephone ring downstairs, once, twice, then a third time, and with it came another sound, so soft she would have missed it if she had moved. Inside the wall beside her, something gave a tiny electric cheer. Not a ring, not exactly. The faint mechanical stir of an instrument attempting to wake. Margaret did not run. Later, she would wonder why. She simply turned her head and stood looking at the patched wall while the downstairs phone continued its urgent ringing below. The sound in the wall came again, a frail companion to the stronger peal downstairs, as though a second telephone, buried behind plaster and paint, were trying to answer from inside the house. When she lifted the receiver in the hall, the line was already alive. A man was breathing hard, not speaking, breathing the way people do when they are trying not to cough. Then came a woman's voice, raw and far away, saying there was someone still upstairs. Margaret felt the blood leave her hands. She said hello, and her own voice sounded flat and foolish against the depth of panic on the line. There was a burst of static. Another voice, calm, official, asking how many were inside. The woman answered, but the words blurred in a wash of crackle, then sharpened for just a second into one phrase. The back room. Margaret put the receiver down with such care it seemed she was lowering a sleeping child. The following afternoon, she went to the public library and sat beneath the soft heat of green-shaded lamps while rain darkened the windows. Old newspaper archives, neighborhood clippings, municipal records. It took hours. Much of what she found was incomplete. Addresses had been abbreviated or omitted. Fires in older parts of Seattle were common enough in the record to blur together. But there was one account, brief and yellowed in reproduction, about a house fire on a steep residential street north of downtown. A call for help had been placed shortly after midnight. One adult had escaped. Others had not. The report did not name the room where they were found. It did mention that telephone service in the house had continued to function for some unknown interval during the fire. A detail so strange the reporter had framed it almost as an aside. Several neighbors, the clipping said, later claimed they heard the phone ringing inside the burning structure even after firefighters entered. The clipping gave no more than that, and Margaret told herself she should have felt relieved. There was a real event beneath the story. A documented accident, distorted over the years by repetition and superstition. But relief did not come. The more solid the old fire became, the worse the calls seemed. It was no longer a matter of imagination drifting through empty rooms. There had been a night. There had been voices. Somewhere in Seattle's older web of switchboards, operators, rewired homes, storm-damaged lines, and remembered tragedy, a thread had not fully broken. She stopped sleeping well. She found herself listening during the day for the ring that never came until dark. She unplugged the telephone one evening and sat in the living room with a book she did not read, watching the cord coiled on the floor. Near midnight, a small sound came from the hallway table. Not a ring, only the brittle little twitch of current moving through old metal. Then, from upstairs, the faint buried trill inside the wall. By morning, she had plugged the phone back in. A week later, the power failed during a windstorm. The entire block dropped into darkness at once, windows going black up and down the street as branches thrashed overhead. Margaret lit candles and waited for the house to settle. Without electric hum, the rooms felt deeper. The rain scraped the panes like handfuls of sand. Somewhere, a car alarm cried out once, then stopped. She was halfway up the staircase with a candle in hand when the telephone rang below. In the dark, it sounded much louder than it ever had before. She stood there on the stairs and let it ring 4 times. 5. On the 6th ring, she went down, set the candle in a saucer on the hall table, and answered. The line opened onto confusion so immediate it felt less like hearing than stepping through a door. Voices over voices, orders shouted at a distance, the high pulsing whine of equipment, then the unmistakable clipped tone of an emergency operator asking for the address again. Not once, again. Someone was sobbing too hard to answer, someone else was shouting that the stairs were gone. Margaret pressed the receiver to her ear until the plastic creaked. Through the layers of sound, another noise emerged, slow and hideous in its intimacy. A telephone ringing somewhere beyond the voices. Not the one in her hand. Another one. Another room. Another part of the same house. She lifted her eyes toward the staircase. At the top, beyond the banister, the second-floor hallway was dark except for a diluted square of streetlight filtering through the back window. In that gray strip of light stood a figure no darker than the hall around it, and for one moment, Margaret thought it was a coat hanging from a door. Then it moved. Not toward her, only enough to turn its head, as if listening down the stairs to the ring in her hand. The line went dead. She left the house before dawn and spent the rest of the night in a hotel near the water where the carpet smelled faintly of bleach and the walls were thin enough to let in the sounds of strangers arriving late. Even there, she woke twice, convinced a telephone was ringing in the room. By daylight, she almost believed she had imagined the figure. Exhaustion could do that. Grief could do more. But when she returned home, the candle saucer was still on the hall table, and on the second floor, the back bedroom door, which she knew she had left open, now stood shut. Margaret did not open it immediately. She made tea first, she stood at the sink and watched rain climb the glass in silver threads. Only when the kettle had gone silent did she carry her cup upstairs and place her hand on the knob. The room beyond was unchanged at first glance. Boxes, iron frame, window gray with weather. Then she saw the wallpaper debris on the floor by the far wall. A square section had come loose in the night. Behind it sat a shallow cavity between studs, and within that cavity, fixed to old wood, blackened at the edges as if by heat long ago, was a telephone cradle without a handset. The cord had been cut decades earlier. The metal hooks were rusted. Beneath them, clinging to the wood, hung a small paper tag, browned nearly to illegibility. On it, in faded handwriting, was a single note. Do not answer after the ringing stops. Margaret read it twice. There was no signature, nothing to suggest when it had been written or by whom, yet it felt less like a warning left for future owners than a rule discovered too late by someone who had needed the house to keep one last boundary. She stepped back until the bed frame touched her knees. For 3 nights, she obeyed the note. When the telephone rang downstairs, she let it ring out. Sometimes it stopped after a handful of chimes, sometimes it rang long enough to seem angry. Each time, after silence returned, she listened for the weak, hidden stir inside the wall upstairs. It always came a few seconds later. A second chance, perhaps. Or a second caller. On the 4th night, curiosity overcame fear in the patient way curiosity often does, not as courage, but as weariness. The call came just before midnight. Rain ticked against the windows. The house felt taut from roof to foundation. Margaret waited in the dark hall while the phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times, 4. Then it stopped. The silence afterward was larger than the ringing had been. From the back bedroom wall came the frail, buried trill. Margaret climbed the stairs. She moved with one hand on the banister, feeling the smooth, worn wood beneath her palm. At the end of the hallway, the bedroom door was open, though she had closed it earlier. Inside, the cavity in the wall seemed blacker than the rest of the room. The hidden telephone cradle could not ring, and yet the sound continued from within the plaster, a thin, insistent trembling. Margaret stepped close enough to smell old dust and damp paper. Then, from the darkness inside the wall, a voice began to speak. It was not loud, it was not even clear at first, only a murmur under static, so faint she had to lean in until her forehead nearly touched the cracked plaster edge. The voice was female, strained and breathless. It sounded less like a ghost than like a recording surviving badly. It said there was smoke. It gave part of an address that Margaret could not make herself hear twice. Then it said something else, a phrase almost lost under the hiss. He is still on the stairs. Margaret stepped back so quickly she struck the bed frame. At the bedroom doorway stood a man in a dark coat wet with rain that did not seem to drip. His face was impossible to hold in focus, as if the dim room refused to keep it. He was not burned, he was not ruined. He only looked like someone interrupted while trying to reach another room. One hand was lifted slightly from his side, not reaching for her, not beckoning, only caught in the unfinished motion of a person climbing in darkness toward a ringing phone. Then the entire room filled with the smell of cold smoke. Not fresh fire, old smoke. Smoke that had soaked itself into beams and horsehair plaster and forgotten curtains and never fully left. Margaret put out a sound so small it barely counted as breath. When she looked again, the doorway was empty. Downstairs, the hallway telephone began to ring once more. She did not live in the house much longer. According to neighbors, she moved before spring had fully come in, leaving some furniture behind and refusing to discuss the sale. The place stood empty for a season, then changed hands. Over time, the story thinned and spread, as such stories do. Some said an owner discovered old fire damage hidden behind renovated walls. Some said the city records never match the address cleanly because streets shift in memory faster than they do on maps. Some insisted there had been no fire in that house at all, only nearby, and that the entire legend grew from crossed lines and anxious people listening too hard at night. Yet, the rumor remained, tied not to the building itself, but to the telephone. People on that stretch of hill, especially in the older homes, still mention odd rings during storms, a call with no number displayed, a line that opens onto confusion already in progress, footsteps, dispatchers, voices asking for the address again. Most hang up at once. A few keep listening long enough to hear what sounds like another telephone ringing farther in, deeper in the house than any room should allow. And one detail survives in nearly every version, though no one agrees where it began. If the ringing stops before the call is answered, it is better to let the silence remain. Because according to the oldest version of the story, the second ring does not come from the telephone in the hall. It comes from the room where someone never made it out. The night the 911 operator hung up first. By the time the operator understood that the caller was answering too late, the line had already gone quiet once, then opened again on its own with a soft scrape, as if the receiver had been lifted by a hand that did not know what a telephone was supposed to sound like. The county dispatch room sat behind the sheriff's office in a low building of painted cinder block with one narrow window facing a gravel lot and the black outline of the hills beyond. At that hour, there was only one operator on duty, a woman who had worked the night shift long enough to know the different silences of the county. There was the silence of winter roads after midnight, when even the logging trucks were gone. There was the silence that came before a domestic call, when breathing filled the line but nobody wanted to speak first. And there was the silence of open land, old houses, and telephone wires stretched across hollows where the dark seemed to collect and stay. The call that came in just after 3 o'clock in the morning did not match any of those. The first part of the recording, according to later reports, was incomplete. The county's equipment was old even then, and pieces of incoming audio were known to drop out or distort. What survived began with the operator identifying the line and asking what the emergency was. For a few seconds, there was nothing but a faint rushing sound. Then, a man's voice, distant and thinned by static, said that he needed help. The operator asked him to repeat himself. There was another delay. Then, in the same voice, a little closer this time, he said that something was outside his house. It would not have been unusual by itself. In that part of West Virginia, people called for bears in the yard, strangers on porches, headlights lingering too long at the end of a drive. The operator asked for the address. What made the call strange was not the fear in the man's voice, but the pattern. Each time she asked a question, there was a pause just a little too long to sound natural, followed by an answer that seemed to come not from someone thinking, but from someone listening first. Not to her, to something else. She asked for the address again. A long hush followed. The tape held a faint clicking, not unlike an extension line being lifted somewhere else in the house. Then the man said, carefully, as if repeating words fed to him, that he was at the old roundhouse beyond the creek crossing near the county line. The operator knew the place only vaguely. Rural callers often gave directions instead of house numbers. She asked for a name. Another pause. This time, the answer came wrong. The voice gave the address again, almost word for word, but slower. The operator corrected him, asked again for his name, and when the reply came, it arrived with the same soft delay as if it had crossed a room before entering the mouth that spoke it. According to people who later heard the recording, that was the moment her tone changed. It did not break, she did not panic, but the steadiness flattened. She began speaking more distinctly, as operators are trained to do with frightened callers, and she asked whether the man was alone in the house. The tape carried a low shuffling sound. A hinge moved somewhere. The caller did not answer at first. Then he whispered that he thought so. Outside the dispatch room, nothing moved. The sheriff's deputies were covering a wide area that night, one on a traffic stop near the highway and another farther south on a welfare check. The operator started one unit toward the caller's area, then kept the man talking as best she could. She asked what he could hear. The caller said there had been knocking at the back door for almost an hour. Not loud, not trying to get in, only patient. 3 taps. Then nothing, then 3 taps again. He said his dogs had gone under the kitchen table and would not come out. The operator asked whether he could lock himself in a room. The delay came again. Then the man said, in the same careful tone, that he had already done that. It should have reassured her. It did the opposite. The room sound on the call did not match a closed bedroom or a bathroom. Even through the poor quality of the tape, there was an openness to it, the soft hollow of a larger space. She asked which room he was in. There was no answer. Then, faintly, another voice could be heard. People disagree about that part. Some later said it was only feedback or the warble of bad equipment. Others believed there were 2 people on the line, one farther from the receiver. The surviving audio is not clear enough to prove either version. But several who reviewed the report said the operator reacted as though she heard something she could not place because she stopped speaking for a moment, then asked very quietly whether anyone else was in the room with him. Nothing. Static. A single, dull tap. Then the man answered no. A deputy reached the road nearest the property several minutes later and radioed that the house sat back from the lane at the end of a washed-out drive with no outside lights on. The operator relayed this to the caller, telling him help was almost there. For the first time, the voice on the line seemed to respond without the strange delay. It said thank you immediately with such abrupt relief that she must have felt some easing in her chest. Then, after a pause, the voice added that something had just moved in the hallway. What followed is one of the details repeated most often in retellings of the incident. The operator told the caller not to leave the room, not to make any noise, and to stay on the line. The tape captured a slow creaking sound that might have been floorboards or the receiver shifting in a hand gone damp with sweat. Then there came a series of very soft knocks. Not from the back door, not distant, close. So close that the sound seemed to come through the telephone itself. 3 taps. A pause. 3 taps again. The operator spoke the caller's name, or what she believed was his name from an earlier garbled exchange. There was no answer. Instead, she heard breathing, but it no longer sounded frightened. It sounded measured, curious, the kind of breath someone takes while listening through a wall. The deputy outside radioed that he was approaching the porch. The operator told the caller deputies were entering the property. The line stayed open. In the recording, a new noise emerged then, one that investigators later described only as movement near the mouthpiece. Cloth brushing plastic, a fingernail or ring striking the handset once. Then the man's voice returned, but farther away than before. So far away, it seemed to come from the end of a hall. It said, with that same odd care, do not let them knock. The operator asked what he meant. The voice did not answer. The deputy, now at the door, reported no lights, no response, and no sign of forced entry. The operator told him the caller might be hiding inside. She stayed on the line and asked the man if he could hear the deputy outside. This time, the delay was longer than any before, long enough that she repeated the question. Then the voice said yes. But the deputy radioed at that same moment that he had not knocked yet. After that, the surviving record becomes more confused. One report says the operator asked the caller whether he could see whoever was outside his room. Another says she asked whether there was a second phone in the house. Either way, what matters is that the answer came back before she had finished speaking, not after. It arrived on top of her words in a low murmur, as though whatever was listening had finally learned the timing. Witnesses later claimed that the operator pulled the headset slightly away from one ear at that moment. She would not discuss it in detail afterward. All she ever admitted was that she became certain, for reasons she could not cleanly explain, that the man who had placed the call was no longer the one speaking to her. Whether that belief came from the pacing of the responses, the change in breathing, or the simple animal feeling that something had shifted on the line, nobody could say. The deputy entered through an unlocked back door. He swept the kitchen first. 2 dogs were found under the table, pressed so far back against the wall that he had to crouch to see their eyes. A chair had been overturned near the sink, the phone on the kitchen wall hung in its cradle, the cord was still untouched. There was no one in the room, no obvious sign that a call had been made from there. The operator heard him moving from room to room over the radio while the line in her headset remained open, full of soft breathing and the faintest scrape, as if the caller were dragging one finger across wallpaper. The deputy checked a sitting room, then a narrow hallway, then the front room facing the road. No one. He reported a damp footprint on the hall floor, but only one, too smeared to judge clearly and odd in shape. Before the operator could ask more, the voice on her line spoke again. It asked whether the deputy was alone. She did not answer. Later, according to coworkers, she said the question felt less like fear and more like appetite. The training manuals on her desk, the illuminated buttons, the buzzing fluorescent light overhead, all the ordinary objects around her began to seem very far away. She pressed her hand against the edge of the console to steady herself and told the deputy to exit the house immediately. He demanded a reason. She did not give one. She only repeated the order, sharper this time. By then, the second deputy had arrived outside. The first deputy began backing toward the kitchen. As he moved, he radioed that one bedroom door at the end of the hall was shut. He said he had not opened it yet because he thought he heard movement inside. The operator closed her eyes for one brief second. When she spoke again, she told him not to open it. The deputy asked why. She said she had the caller on the line, and the caller was not in that room. Nobody ever produced a perfectly satisfying explanation for what happened next. The first deputy ignored her and opened the bedroom door. Inside, according to official notes, the room was empty except for a bed, a lamp, and a small table with a second telephone lying on its side. The line to that phone had been cut, not recently, but some time before. The copper darkened, the outer sheath dry with dust. On the bedspread, close to the pillow, was an impression deep enough to suggest weight had rested there for a long while. The window above the bed stood open to the black yard behind the house. And from the dispatcher's headset, all at once, there came the sound of knocking again. Not 3 taps this time. 1. Then another, heavier, resonant, and close, like a fist striking wood from the inside. The operator tore the headset off. That was the part people remembered, because operators did not do that. They were trained to stay with a caller through almost anything. But she let the headset fall against the console, and the room microphone picked up enough of the open line for others nearby to hear a voice continuing to speak from the earpiece. Not loudly, not clearly. Just enough to make the hair rise along the necks of the people who later described it. No suspect was found on the property, no caller was identified with certainty. The house belonged, according to county records, to an elderly man who had died some months earlier, though neighbors reportedly claimed a relative came and went from time to time. Some said they had seen a light in the place within the last week. Others insisted it had been empty much longer than that. The available reports do not settle the question. The audio itself remained incomplete, with segments missing at the beginning and end, and some portions badly degraded. What did enter local memory, and stay there, was not the paperwork, but the pattern. The operator had received a call from a house where no working phone appeared to have placed it. She had spoken to a man whose identity could not be pinned down. She had realized, before the deputies did, that the voice answering her questions was changing. And at the moment when trained instinct should have kept her calm and connected, she had done the one thing dispatchers were not supposed to do. She hung up first. Afterwards, she worked only day shifts for a while. Then, not long after, she left the county job entirely. People who knew her said she never liked to discuss the case, though one former coworker remembered her saying that what frightened her was not the possibility of a prank or even a person hiding in the house. It was the delay. The voice always seemed to wait, she said, as though someone else in the room had to hear the question before the answer could be given. In the hills, stories rarely stay fixed. They gather weather and rumor. By the time the tale had traveled through diners, porches, gas stations, and late kitchen conversations, it had changed shape the way all local legends do. Some said the caller had been dead before the phone ever rang. Some said there had been a prowler moving through abandoned houses, lifting receivers, and listening to people breathe. Some said the open bedroom window faced a patch of ground where no grass had grown right for years. And some claimed that on damp nights, if the lines were bad and the county was quiet, dispatchers still heard an extra click before certain calls connected, like someone in another room picking up an extension and saying nothing. None of that was ever proved. But in rural counties, proof does not always kill a story. Sometimes the uncertainty feeds it. A deputy who later retired told the story only once in public, at a civic supper, and even then he avoided the worst parts. He said the thing he remembered most was not the bedroom, or the cut phone line, or the dogs under the table. It was stepping back onto the porch after searching the house and seeing the operator's patrol lights spill across the yard while all the woods beyond remained perfectly still. No wind, no insects. No movement in the trees, just that stillness, deep and watchful, as if the hillside itself had been listening to the call. Years later, people still argued over the details. They argued about the missing seconds on the tape, about whether there had truly been a second voice, about whether the house was occupied, about whether the operator's instincts had saved a deputy from walking deeper into something human or something worse. Those arguments never resolved anything. They only kept the story breathing. And the last part, the quietest part, lingered longest. When the supervisor reviewed the damaged recording near dawn, after the deputies had cleared the scene and the sun had not yet reached the valley, there was almost nothing left at the end. Just static, a faint shift of plastic against a desk, and the soft click of the operator disconnecting the line. Then, beneath it, so faint it could easily have been tape noise, there seemed to be one final sound. Not a voice. Not exactly. More like someone very close to the mouthpiece, learning how to whisper after the call was already over. Next story. The Friendly Stranger on the Trail. The Appalachian Trail stretches for over 2,000 miles, a continuous ribbon of dirt woven through the oldest mountains in North America. Hikers call it the Green Tunnel. In the spring, the canopy grows thick, choking out the sunlight and wrapping travelers in a perpetual damp twilight. There is a deep, primal silence there, broken only by the crunch of boots on leaves and the distant calls of unseen birds. It is a place where people go to find peace, to leave the noise of civilization behind. But that same isolation demands a heavy toll. Out in the deep woods, miles from the nearest paved road, you are completely cut off from the world. There are no police, there are no sirens. If you scream, the sound is swallowed by a million ancient trees. In this quiet void, a specific culture has evolved, one built entirely on implicit trust. Hikers rely on each other. They share food, they share shelter, and they trust the strangers they meet at the end of a long day of walking. It is a beautiful system, fragile as glass. And when that glass violently shatters, it leaves a jagged, bleeding wound that the forest never forgets. In May of 1981, the trail through Virginia was blooming with new life. Robert Mountford and Laura Ramsey were 27 years old, far from their home in Maine. They were social workers, people who dedicated their lives to helping troubled youth and the marginalized. Their hearts were open, their demeanors naturally kind and empathetic. Taking time away from the heavy emotional toll of their professions, they had set out to hike the Appalachian Trail. By the time they reached Giles County, Virginia, they had already walked for weeks. They were hardened to the physical demands of the trail, their legs strong, their heavy packs settled perfectly against their shoulders. They had fallen into the hypnotic, repetitive rhythm of the long-distance hiker, wake at dawn, walk through the morning mist, rest in the afternoon heat, and find a wooden shelter before sunset. They knew the unwritten rules of the woods, they knew how to read a topographic map, how to filter stream water, and how to spot a friendly face. The culture of the trail dictates that fellow hikers and locals who frequent the path are kindred spirits. There is a common term, trail magic, used to describe the unexpected acts of kindness bestowed upon weary travelers. A cold drink left by a trailhead, a lift into a resupply town, or a local offering a warm fire and conversation at a shelter. When Robert and Laura approached the Wapiti shelter in the Jefferson National Forest, the sun was beginning its slow descent behind the ridges. The shadows stretched long and thin across the dirt. It was late afternoon, perhaps around 5 o'clock. Their bodies ached for rest. The shelter was a simple, three-sided wooden structure with a tin roof, a common sight along the trail, designed to offer a dry, elevated place to sleep. But they were not alone. A man was already sitting near the shelter. He looked like any other local who might wander up the mountain for a day of scouting or camping. He was young, in his late 20s, blending seamlessly into the rustic environment with his unkempt hair and rugged clothes. His name was Randall Lee Smith. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable or threatening about him. He greeted Robert and Laura with the familiar, easygoing charm that hikers expect from rural Virginians. He knew the woods intimately. He knew the trails. He offered them the kind of casual, soft-spoken conversation that eases the fatigue of a 20-mile day. Robert and Laura dropped their heavy packs, their muscles sighing in relief. They set out their foam sleeping pads and pulled out their small brass camp stoves to boil water for dinner. The atmosphere was light and welcoming. They shared the small dirt clearing with Smith, treating him with the same open-hearted trust they offered to everyone they met on their journey. They exchanged stories. They talked about the weather, the steep conditions of the path ahead, the quiet beauty of the surrounding forest. Smith listened, nodding, smiling softly at their anecdotes. He played the part of the friendly trail angel to absolute perfection. As the light faded from the sky and the cold, damp air of the mountain evening settled over the camp, the three of them sat near the shelter. The woods grew dark, transitioning into the kind of absolute, suffocating blackness that only exists miles away from electric lights. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the stars through the leaves and the beam of a single flashlight. Then, the atmosphere in the camp began to shift. It was not a sudden explosion of violence, but a slow, agonizing drop in the psychological temperature. The casual conversation naturally ebbed as the night deepened, but the silence that followed was not the comfortable, heavy-lidded quiet of tired travelers. It was taut, it was expectant. Robert and Laura, highly attuned to human behavior through their years of social work, might have felt the first subtle prickle of unease on the back of their necks. The friendly local was no longer making small talk. He was no longer looking at the trees or the dirt. He was just sitting, watching them. The horror of the Wapiti shelter did not begin with a shout or a sudden lunge. It began with the slow, deliberate death of a smile. The amiable, easygoing mask that Randall Lee Smith wore began to slip away, muscle by muscle. The warmth vanished entirely from his eyes, leaving behind a stare as cold, flat, and empty as a frozen lake. He was looking at Robert and Laura not as fellow human beings, not as interesting travelers from out of state, but as objects. The physical transformation in his posture was complete, and it was utterly terrifying. The realization of what was happening would have washed over the young couple like freezing water. They were not sharing a camp with a trail angel. They were trapped in a cage of trees with a predator. The silence of the deep woods suddenly turned deeply hostile. The chirping of the night insects sounded like a mocking chorus. The closest paved road was miles away over rough terrain. The nearest town was nothing but a distant rumor. There was no cell phone service in 1981, no handheld radios, no panic button to press. Every survival instinct they possessed was screaming that the man sitting just feet away from them was a lethal threat, but there was nowhere to run. The Appalachian Trail is treacherous at night, a twisting, narrow path of slippery roots and jagged rocks that would easily break an ankle in the pitch black. They were pinned down in the open front of the three-sided shelter, utterly exposed to the dark and to the man sitting in it. When Smith finally produced a weapon, the illusion of safety was permanently and violently shattered. The friendly stranger who had shared their evening, who had listened to their stories of Maine, who had smiled at their jokes, was now holding their lives in his hands. It is the ultimate paralyzing nightmare of the wilderness, the profound, unfathomable betrayal of trust. To look into the face of someone you just shared bread with, only to find a hollow, emotionless void looking back at you. He had played a game with them. He had sat patiently, waiting for the sun to disappear, waiting for them to take off their heavy boots, waiting for them to become completely physically and mentally vulnerable. The extreme isolation of the forest, once a source of deep spiritual comfort for the hikers, became an inescapable, suffocating trap. The ancient trees stood as silent, indifferent witnesses to the slow, methodical cruelty that was about to unfold. Robert Mountford and Laura Ramsey never walked out of the Jefferson National Forest. Their journey of self-discovery ended brutally in the dirt and wet leaves of Giles County. Robert was shot point blank. Laura fought desperately for her life, a frantic struggle in the dark woods, but was ultimately bludgeoned and stabbed to death. Smith dragged their bodies into the brush and buried them in shallow graves near the shelter, leaving their grieving families and the entire hiking community in a state of sheer devastation. When their remains were finally discovered days later, the inherent innocence of the Appalachian Trail was fractured beyond repair. The murders sent a permanent shockwave of paranoia through the tight-knit community of long-distance backpackers. The sacred, unwritten law of implicit trust had been violently violated. Decades later, the ghost of that betrayal still haunts the Long Green Tunnel. The original Wapiti shelter was eventually dismantled, torn down piece by piece to erase the physical reminder of the nightmare, but the mountain soil there retains the heavy memory. Every hiker who walks through the dense, darkening woods of Virginia must eventually grapple with a chilling knowledge. The greatest danger in the wild is not the black bears, nor the freezing weather, nor the treacherous rocky terrain. The true horror is the realization that a warm smile can be a hunting tactic, and that miles from the safety of civilization, the friendly stranger on the trail might just be waiting for the sun to go down. Next story. The Siege of the Little Men. There is a specific kind of darkness that blankets the rural American South in late summer. It is not just an absence of light, but a heavy, suffocating presence, thick with the humidity of August and the deafening drone of cicadas. In the farming community of Kelly, Kentucky, the nights belong to the cornfields. The towering stalks sway in the warm breeze, creating a wall of shadows that stretches for miles in every direction. If you scream out there, the sound is swallowed by the earth. If something approaches from the depths of those fields, you will not see it until it is standing right at your door. On the evening of August 21st, 1955, 11 people were crammed inside the small, unpainted Sutton farmhouse. It was a modest home, devoid of running water or a telephone, sitting isolated at the end of a long dirt driveway. The family was winding down from a long day of brutal heat. Around 7 in the evening, a visiting friend named Billy Ray Taylor stepped out the back door to draw a bucket of water from the well. He barely made it to the pump. He came rushing back inside, his face pale and slick with sweat, claiming he had just watched a massive, glowing metallic object streak across the twilight sky and land silently in a deep gully just beyond the edge of the property. The others in the house dismissed him. They reasoned it was a shooting star or perhaps a trick of the fading light. Billy Ray insisted, but the stifling heat of the house sapped any energy for argument. The matter was dropped until the farm dog in the yard began to bark. It was not the usual territorial warning. It was a frantic, terrified shrieking that ended abruptly as the animal scrambled under the foundation of the house, refusing to come out. A heavy silence fell over the property, drowning out even the chorus of the insects. Elmer Lucky Sutton, the patriarch of the house, exchanged a long look with Billy Ray. Neither man spoke, but both moved toward the corner of the room. Lucky picked up his 12-gauge shotgun. Billy Ray took up a .22 caliber hunting rifle. They loaded the chambers, the metallic clatter of the mechanism sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet house. They opened the back door and stepped out onto the porch, peering into the dense blackness of the yard. At first, there was only the rustling of the corn, then they saw it. Emerging from the tree line, roughly 40 feet away, was a faint, luminous glow. As it moved closer, the glow took the shape of a figure. It was small, perhaps 3 feet tall, with an oversized head and massive, glowing yellow eyes that sat flush against the sides of its face. Its arms were grotesquely long, spindly appendages ending in sharp talons that nearly dragged on the grass. The most unnatural thing was the way it moved. It did not walk. It seemed to float, gliding over the uneven ground with a swaying, weightless motion, its hands raised in the air as if surrendering, yet it kept coming steadily toward the men. Fear, primal and cold, gripped the two men. When the creature closed the distance to roughly 20 feet, Lucky raised the shotgun. At that range, a 12-gauge blast is utterly devastating. He pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of the gunshot shattered the quiet night, a massive burst of flame illuminating the yard. The buckshot struck the creature squarely in the chest. But there was no blood. There was no tearing of flesh. Instead, a sharp, ringing sound echoed across the yard. Tring. It sounded exactly like a bullet striking an empty metal bucket. The force of the blast flipped the creature backward in a somersault, but it did not scream. It merely righted itself, uninjured, and scrambled away into the deep shadows on all fours, moving with the terrifying speed of an insect. Lucky and Billy Ray backed into the house, slamming the wooden door and throwing the deadbolt. Panic erupted inside. The women grabbed the frightened children, dragging them into the center of the house, away from the exterior walls. The home had instantly transformed from a sanctuary into a wooden box, surrounded on all sides by an impenetrable dark. They turned off all the lamps, plunging the rooms into pitch blackness to avoid silhouetting themselves against the windows. The men positioned themselves at the glass, their hands trembling, gripping their weapons so tightly their knuckles ached. The siege had begun. For several agonizing minutes, there was nothing. Then, a soft scraping sound came from the dining room window. Lucky moved cautiously toward the doorway. Framed in the glass, pressed directly against the pane, was a pale, glowing face. The enormous yellow eyes stared unblinking into the dark house. Billy Ray fired the rifle right through the glass. The window exploded outward in a shower of shards. The bullet found its mark, but again, the sound of metal striking metal rang out. The creature simply dropped out of sight, disappearing below the sill. The men realized they had to ensure the perimeter was clear. They crept out the front door, stepping onto the small concrete porch, aiming their weapons into the yard. As Billy Ray took a step forward, a clawed hand reached down from the low, overhanging awning of the roof. Pale fingers twisted violently into his hair, pulling him upward. The women inside screamed. Lucky spun around, shoved his shotgun barrel upward toward the roof, and fired blindly. Another metallic ricochet cut through the smoke. The grip released, and the creature tumbled onto the ground, quickly scurrying out of sight into the brush. They retreated inside once more, barricading the door. It was then that the true horror of their situation settled over them. Their weapons, the heavy firearms designed to stop a man or a wild beast in its tracks, were entirely useless. They were trapped miles from town, surrounded by a sea of corn, defending their family against entities that could not be killed. Then came the sound. The farmhouse roof was made of corrugated tin. The thin metal amplified every movement above them. It started as a soft pressure, the creak of weight settling onto the panels. Then, the scraping began. The sharp, rhythmic drag of talons moving across the ridges of the tin roof. Scrape, drag, scrape. The family sat frozen in the center of the living room, breathing in the stale air and the acrid smell of spent sulfur, listening as the weightless footsteps paced back and forth directly over their heads. They could hear multiple creatures up there communicating in strange, high-pitched chattering noises. Every few minutes, a glowing face would slowly rise at one of the windows, peek inside, and duck away before the men could raise their guns. The psychological torture of the invasion wore them down. The constant scratching, the terrifying metallic ping of their useless bullets, the glowing eyes in the dark. By 11 at night, the terror reached a breaking point. The family could no longer endure the claustrophobia of the dark house. On a desperate signal, all 11 people bolted from the front door, piling violently into the two family cars parked in the yard. They turned the keys, the engines roaring to life, and sped down the dirt driveway, kicking up a massive cloud of dust as they fled toward the highway. They drove blindly into the city of Hopkinsville, arriving at the police station in a state of absolute hysteria. The police chief noted that these were hardened country people, yet they were trembling so violently they could barely speak. The children were catatonic with fear. Recognizing the genuine terror in their eyes, the chief assembled a massive response. City police, state troopers, and military police from the nearby Fort Campbell Army Base formed a heavily armed caravan and drove back to the Kelly farmhouse. They arrived to find the property silent. The officers scoured the yard with high-powered flashlights. They found the shattered window. They found dozens of spent shotgun shells and rifle casings littering the grass. They noticed a strange, luminous patch on the ground where one of the creatures had been shot and knocked over, a patch that glowed faintly green in the beam of their flashlights. But there were no bodies. There were no tracks. Finding no immediate threat, and assuming the trespassers had fled, the vast police presence slowly packed up and left. The last cruiser rolled down the dirt driveway at roughly 2:15 in the morning, leaving the exhausted Sutton family alone once again. The family locked the doors and huddled together in the living room, desperately hoping the nightmare was over. The house was quiet, the crickets had begun to chirp again. The heavy southern heat pressed down on the roof. Then, at 3:30 in the morning, a soft scrape echoed from the kitchen. Lucky turned his head slowly. Rising steadily from the bottom edge of the broken kitchen window, bathed in a faint, sickly glow, were two massive yellow eyes. The scratching on the tin roof resumed. The metallic drag of claws echoed through the wooden rafters. The creatures had merely waited in the high corn for the police to leave. The siege continued for another 2 hours. The men fired their remaining ammunition, listening in despair to the agonizing, hollow ping of bullets bouncing off the unearthly invaders. The family sat helpless in the dark, watching the shadows move outside, waiting for the walls to give way. It was not until the first faint light of dawn broke over the horizon at 5 in the morning that the creatures finally retreated, slipping back into the deep woods and the endless rows of corn, never to be seen again. The Sutton family did not stay to see another night. They packed their belongings and abandoned the farmhouse shortly after. They left behind a home scarred by bullet holes and shattered glass, and a quiet farming town that would never completely wash away the stain of that August night. But worst of all, they carried away the lingering memory of the dark, the useless weight of a loaded gun, and the endless, terrifying sound of claws dragging across a metal roof.